Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Issei Became Heaven's Chosen. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Snow fell lightly onto the ground, creating a thin white blanket as far as the eye could see. For a region so close to the ice of Siberia, this amount of snow was negligible. Yet for him, the blanket oddly reminded him of home, a light dusting outside while he curled up by a window with a hot cup of cocoa. He shivered as a cool, light breeze ruffled his dark blonde hair. He had missed such days, the swing between hot summers and cold winters, and he wondered how his family in Japan was doing. Moving to Italy to become a priest had moved him into warmer weather, something he and his sweat glands never quite came to terms with. He never minded. It was a calling from God and he was more than happy to answer it. A mother and her son called out greetings as they passed the church. Noah Camillo waved as he swept the steps clear of snow and leaves. He had been sent here temporarily by the church to manage the local parish in a small village where Roman Catholics were a modest community. He smiled softly. He never particularly minded the specifics of other faiths. He could recall older, hawkish members of many branches of Christianity who disliked one another, and he chuckled at how even within the same faith people could never fully agree. It was, he thought, part of human nature. Layla approached him from behind and asked what he had been thinking about. Noah told her it was nothing. A pair of arms wrapped around him and filled him with warmth, and he placed his hand over hers, quietly grateful for her presence. If the church discovered he had broken his vow of celibacy, he could not imagine the consequences, but even that fear did not make him regret her. Noah asked if Layla was cold. She said that angels did not get cold much, though she admitted it was a little chilly and nuzzled against him. She linked her arm with his, and he felt comforted by the simple contact. They had been married 2 years and had made a small sanctuary for themselves and their child, away from prying eyes. Noah suggested they go inside to warm up together. Layla teased him lightly for being bold and he laughed. Their quiet moment was broken by a panicked voice approaching at speed. A ragged man ran up the steps, covered in ash and soot with singed clothing and looking badly shaken. Layla immediately moved to help him to the stairs. Noah dashed inside for a first aid kit and returned quickly with gauze and bandages. He asked the man Yuri what had happened and why he looked so frightened. Yuri gasped that there was a monster in town, a living shadow. Layla asked for clarification as an explosion sounded in the distance. She went on edge and sparks of light began to gather at her fingertips. Noah felt his own anxiety rise. Yuri rocked back and forth in panic, convinced the thing would kill them all. Noah tried to calm him and insisted that he and Layla would handle it. Layla interrupted and told Noah to make sure their baby was safe while she checked the situation. Herself, she insisted she would be fine and reminded him that she was an angel. With a confident smile, she manifested a violet halo and 3 pairs of white wings. With one powerful beat she took to the sky, leaving a trail of feathers behind. Yuri could only stare in awe. Noah realized he had forgotten to secure Yuri's comm and moved behind the man, using a swift, non-lethal technique to render him unconscious to prevent further panic. He then placed his hand to his forehead and performed a discreet memory-clearing gesture. A yellow magic circle glowed briefly before a black pillar of light descended from above and struck the town square. Noah looked up, worried, and thought that Layla was already using Lelial. He needed to get over there and help her. Layla had no idea what to make of the apparition before her. It matched Yuri's description in the only way her mind could conceive. A living shadow, a shape that seemed to violate the senses themselves. The world around it recoiled as if rejecting its existence, yet that resistance did nothing to stop it. The shadowy wisp turned to look at her. In the place where eyes might have been, 2 pits of violet light glowed eerily. Its stare unnerved her completely. She had seen battle before the Great War had been the most tragic PRD of her life, but nothing had prepared her for the anxiety of confronting this thing. Then the shadow smiled. A cold sensation slithered down her spine and her body reacted on instinct. It lunged, She narrowly evaded an outstretched tendril and felt a sharp sting on her cheek from a graze. In an instant its limb had crossed the distance between them. It almost struck her, but her enhanced senses allowed her to avoid a direct hit. She recognized how dangerous it was and knew she needed to stop it. Black and red light gathered in her hands as she prepared to engage. Layla prayed to heaven for the power to deliver justice upon the demon. Black and red light swelled above her and she brought her arm down. A dark pillar of light representing heaven's judgment slammed into the shadow. The church square buckled under the force. The ground shook and shockwaves rippled out, damaging buildings across the town. She stared in stunned disbelief as the entity remained standing and unharmed, its unnatural mocking smile unwavering. She considered what it might be. This was Slavic territory and, through her ties to the pantheon, she was familiar with the creatures of Slavic myth, but nothing she knew matched this thing. Noah called her name from below. Layla reacted with surprise and concern, asking why he was there and telling him to return to the church. Noah answered that the church was protected by a divine ward and that he would not leave her to face the creature alone. Particles of golden light gathered around his hand as he formed the protection. Layla pressed her lips together and glared at the shadow. She explained that she had used Lelial on it and it was still alive. Noah replied that they would have to strike harder. He recited scripture and performed a motion that summoned a sword of pure light, the air around it shimmering with divine power. The entity turned its gaze toward Noah and struck out with an instant stretch of its shadow arm. Noah dodged and countered, slashing through the tendrils of darkness and scattering them. The entity recoiled briefly. Noah called Layla's name and charged. Layla gathered lightning, hail, and flame and unleashed them. Noah swung his sword of the gospel and released a wave of radiant force. Their combined attack connected. A thunderous explosion filled the square and a great plume of smoke and light rose. Fleeing residents watched from a distance as the blast painted the sky. Noah backed away and scanned the smoke for any sign of the creature. Layla hovered nearby, tense and frightened, gathering more divine power into black spears of light. Suddenly a tendril of void struck Noah, and he was thrown off balance and badly wounded. He fought to remain standing, pain racking his body. Layla cried out in alarm. Noah ordered her to fall back and tried to hold the tendril in place, determined to buy her time. He urged her to go to their daughter and to run, pressing the plea with a strained, bloody smile. He fought through the pain, slicing the tendril and creating an opening. Noah then formed a vast dome of light that enclosed him and the shadow. Layla struck at the barrier but could not break it. She clenched her fists until they bled, but then forced herself to let go. After one last look at Noah, she spread her wings and flew toward the church, her resolve to protect their child unbroken. She flew hard against the cold Ukrainian wind and landed at the church, determined that Noah's sacrifice would not be in vain. She ran to their shared quarters and broke down the door. An infant's cry came from the crib. Layla's expression softened as she scooped her daughter into her arms, calming her with whispered reassurances. The building trembled. The structure shuddered as combat continued nearby. The religious images and portraits around the room twisted and warped into grotesque parodies, their expressions turning into mocking grins. Layla averted her eyes and shielded her daughter from those hateful stares. She blasted a hole through the wall to make an escape route. As she prepared to leave, a sudden sharp pain struck her. She staggered and realized she had been wounded. She steadied herself, wrapped her daughter close, and moved out of the room to continue fleeing toward safety. Layla turned her head fearfully as the world behind her distorted under a spreading dark atmosphere that had consumed the entire church. The surroundings dissolved into a chaotic blend of colors and textures, as if someone had splashed water over a painting. The religious artworks were unrecognizable, warped into a horrific mix of shapes and hues. Beyond the doorway stood the source, a shadowy entity, whose form had become more human than wisp. Layla whispered the name Noah as recognition and horror flooded her. The entity tilted its head and that same twisted smile formed on its face. Its violet, glowing eyes pierced her as it lifted a hand and pointed toward her. The entity uttered the name Sophia in a voice that grated like nails on a chalkboard and crackled with static. Layla spread her wings and raised her hand, invoking a prayer to heaven for power. White light and lightning gathered in her palm, and she launched it at the shadow. A tremendous blast ripped outward, destroying the front of the church and several nearby buildings in a thunderous explosion. Amid the chaos, Layla seized the chance to flee. She needed to reach a place where she could teleport her child away from this nightmare. As she flew, a strike of force cut through the air and tore two of her wings from her back. The blow was instantaneous and she plummeted to the ground, instinctively forming a golden barrier around herself as she hit the earth violently. Layla groaned and propped herself up with shaking hands. Inside the barrier, her infant daughter bawled. Layla pressed her hand to the barrier and kissed it, whispering that she loved her child and that the child must live. She staggered into a nearby barn and, wincing with each step, reached a manger. Placing the infant down, she drew hay over her enough to conceal her and quickly formed several rotating cuboids of light to create a multi-layered barrier around the child. The shadow burst through the barn door, splinters flying as it brought with it the blackness that was consuming the world. Despite grievous injuries, Layla stood her ground, eyes full of resolute determination and acceptance of whatever fate awaited her if it meant her child would survive. Layla declared that it would end there and accused the entity of killing her friends and husband. She vowed not to let it take her child. The entity repeated the name Sophia. The entity lunged. Dark light gathered around Layla and shaped into two lances of light. She rushed to meet the being head-on. Her attacks, fueled by holy power and adrenaline, barely fazed the creature. Layla fell to a knee, coughing as the being looked down at her with cold, mocking violet eyes. Its arm shifted into a massive blade and arced toward her. Layla steadied herself and invoked a devastating technique. She concentrated gravity into a singular point, creating a supergravity sphere that threatened to tear apart the space around it. She called forth a virtual black hole and held the entity tight as the sphere began to consume the immediate area. The black sphere began to erase and draw in the matter around it. A sudden wave of violet light sliced through the sphere. The dark construct collapsed and the light struck Layla, ripping away her remaining arm and wings and leaving her gravely wounded. The black hole dissipated and the entity stood unscathed amid a swirl of iridescent colors. It advanced toward her, raised its bladed arm, and delivered a devastating strike that left Layla broken and motionless. The entity turned toward the crying infant and, for the first time, a flash of emotion, hatred, and contempt crossed its face. It morphed its arm into serrated claws and moved threateningly toward the child. The infant's cry sharpened in danger, and in that instant a burst of iridescent light exploded outward and consumed everything. It was a disturbance that shook them all to their core, an unease they had not felt since their father died in the Great War. Her older brother had wanted to take an army against the town, but she knew better than to provoke the gods who held sway there. As powerful as they were, a war would only expose vulnerabilities. She sighed as the cold wind whipped her hair. It had been centuries since she had felt such unease. She had almost forgotten the sensation. Gazing over a barren crater that stretched into the distance, a chill traveled down her spine. The cold, biting air of winter blew her golden hair as her blue eyes scanned the desolate wasteland where a town and dense forest once stood. Her black dress billowed in the wind as she descended toward the crater's center. Uriel recalled that Michael had said there was a church in this town. A magic circle appeared by her ear. Michael spoke through it and asked if she had found anything. Uriel reported that there was nothing, only a crater. Uriel judged the crater to be about the size of New York City as she studied its edge. She continued to walk, the only sounds the soft winter wind and the crunch of earth beneath her boots. A sense of impending danger clung to her. Scarlet flames curled across the ground as a great sword formed in her hands, its glowing red blade sending embers scattering and scorching the remnants of the land from whatever catastrophic blast had hollowed this place out. Uriel murmured that it was strange and then followed the sound of an infant crying. She hurried toward the noise and found, at the center of the crater, a golden spherical barrier inscribed with faint, ancient characters. Before the barrier, a sludge-like shadowy entity crawled toward the child. Uriel approached, her presence preceded by an overwhelming divinity that spread through the crater and beyond. The entity recoiled at her aura, its violet eyes watching warily as it observed that she felt like an ascendant. Uriel leveled her blade and assumed the creature had been responsible for the devastation. The entity struggled to reconstitute its form while mumbling the name Sophia, which Uriel did not recognize. She noted that, whatever its motives, it had slaughtered a town under heaven's jurisdiction and would be held accountable. The creature lunged with the intent to devour her. Uriel stood steady, raised her sword, and let flames swirl around her. The creature's shadowy form faltered as it charged, and Uriel moved her blade forward. The sword struck true, and a burst of creative fire overwhelmed the entity. It unraveled into light and dissolved, and the resulting ripple of energy swept across the landscape in a brilliant, sweeping line visible from far above. The effect was dramatic rather than gory, like an intense, otherworldly flash from an animated battle. As the entity faded, it warned that this was not the end and that Sophia would see the world fall like all others. Those parting words echoed in Uriel's mind, but she set them aside for the moment and turned to the barrier. Inside the sphere, a child no more than several months old wailed. Uriel placed a hand against the golden surface and gently broke it with a flick. The infant's cries filled the cold air. Uriel scooped the child into her arms, swaddled in a torn pink blanket, and hummed a soft lullaby while rocking the baby until the crying subsided. The infant settled, revealing a pair of deep violet-black eyes that studied her. Uriel brushed ash from the baby's forehead and assessed the child as the sole survivor of that place. As she held the infant, she felt something protruding at the back of the swaddle. Curious, she supported the baby's head and slipped a finger inside the cloth, touching something soft and downy. At the same time, she perceived a faint but undeniable surge of divine power. The sensation told her this was not an ordinary human child but a Nephilim, something extraordinarily rare since father's passing had made such births uncommon. She lifted the baby gently with telekinesis. The child squealed with delight, as if familiar with being lifted that way. Uriel unwrapped the swaddle to find two small wings covered in snow-white down. Uriel barely processed the impossible reality before she declared the infant a miracle child. A magic circle reappeared nearby, and a different male voice contacted Uriel through it, asking her to check in. Uriel replied that she was busy, cradling the baby. The voice inquired whether she had found anything. Uriel answered that she had encountered only a shadow creature, and she asked him to gather everyone because the sensation felt akin to the beast of entropy from 500 years ago. While she spoke, she poked the baby's cheek. The child laughed and grabbed her finger. The voice scoffed at the idea of taking orders, and Uriel, calm and affectionate, addressed him as her brother. He sighed but agreed to mobilize Sandalphon and the other seraphs, asking when she would return. Uriel said she would not return immediately because she needed to handle something and intended to visit a nearby general store first. The man expressed disbelief over a general store, and Uriel explained that babies required many supplies and care. He reacted in shock at the news of a baby, and Uriel told him they had a surprise guest while she dangled a feather above the happily squealing child. Convinced, he said he would gather the others and ended the connection. Uriel sighed, but the baby's cheerful babbling eased her. She smiled, poked the child's soft cheek, and told the little one that they would try to find her parents. Suddenly, the crater filled with a brilliant red flash. When the light faded, the area was left quiet and still, the scene devoid of life. The only remnants of Uriel's presence were a calming, harmonious melody lingering in the air and a small patch of white flowers pushing up through the ruined landscape. Heaven was a paradise that defied simple depiction. It was not merely a box in the sky or an isle of clouds. It existed apart from Earth while still occupying the same dimensional space. The realm was divided into 7 heavens and guarded by a golden gate surrounded by a powerful barrier. To the souls who had earned their blessed sleep and the angels who frequented it, heaven appeared as a vast nebula, far larger than Earth, full of shifting colors and iridescent spheres that glittered like stars. Its ethereal beauty never failed to inspire awe, something Uriel would never tire of. Uriel appeared in a burst of flames and red light at the gates, startling the angels who stood guard. They bowed reverently as the archangel passed through. One of the angels stammered that the other seraphs and archangels were gathered within Ereboth. Uriel nodded, distracted by the tiny bundle swaddled in her arms, and thanked them absent-mindedly. The angels saluted as she moved past. The child cooed happily and reached for Uriel's hair. A pair of angels exchanged surprised looks when they realized Uriel was carrying a bag of human groceries as well, and the last thing they saw before Uriel vanished in a torrent of red flame was the chubby arm of an infant waving. Ereboth stood as the highest level of heaven, the core of all that was holy. A towering pillar rose into the endless cosmic sky, emitting a bright blue light that trailed into shimmering auroras. Streams of undecipherable symbols raced up its surface like bluish-white lights. 10 golden nodes orbited the tower like moons, traveling in concentric circles across the starry sky. Each star etched into the fabric of space shimmered as the tower pulsed and released streams of blue light across the glimmering tapestry. Uriel reappeared on one of the islands surrounding the pillar. The child in her arms reached toward the distant tower. Uriel smiled and allowed the infant to see. She showed the child the Sephirot and explained gently that it was the holy system supporting heaven, enabling miracles and protecting against creatures of darkness, and that there were other things it controlled that the child would have to learn about when older. The baby babbled indistinctly and grabbed at the strap of Uriel's dress. Uriel proposed that they meet the other angels as they walked together. The infant squealed with delight as sparkling lights drifted past, one landing on the tip of a button nose and causing a tiny sneeze. Uriel fought the urge to hug the child too tightly. The infant's charm was disarming. She cleared her throat and composed herself, her eyes flicking to a group of figures gathered at the island's edge. A quiet, private reminder of her role as an archangel of annihilation passed through Uriel for a moment before she looked down at the yawning baby and smiled. A lively blonde angel with 12 wings and a white dress bounded forward, her steps energetic and her robes swaying. Uriel recognized her as Gabriel and stepped back. Gabriel brushed her curly hair aside and smiled with an airhead expression that masked a sharp mind. Gabriel's curiosity quickly turned to astonishment when she saw the bundle in Uriel's arms, and she invoked the father's name as she realized what it might be. Uriel suggested they discuss it later, but the infant began to wail loudly, startling Uriel. Uriel tried to rock and soothe the child, humming to emulate what human mothers did, but the crying continued and soon drew the attention of the other seraphim. A silver-haired male seraph in a silver and blue tailcoat with a blue scarf and a golden halo approached, his golden eyes inspecting the infant with interest. Uriel issued a low, stern warning to watch their words in front of the child. The man raised his hands in a placating gesture. Another female seraph with silvery blue hair and star-decorated attire arrived, making faces to try to calm the infant. Gabriel and the woman traded comments about the child's cuteness and attempted to soothe it. Uriel's oldest brother Michael approached across the island, tall and robed in red with long blonde hair, green eyes, and 12 golden wings that left a trail of feathers. Uriel greeted him respectfully. Michael smiled kindly at the child and noted that the baby appeared to be a miracle child. Gabriel's eyes lit up as she marveled at the rarity. Nephilim had been uncommon, and none had been born of an angel in recent memory. She compared current trends among the Grigori, who seemed to have more Nephilim lately. Uriel pointed out that procreation carried the risk of falling, while fallen angels lacked the same restraint. A small commotion followed among the gathered seraphim as they reacted to the news. Metatron felt a hand jab the back of his head and turned to see Sandalphon glaring at him. Sandalphon chastised him not to use bad words in front of the baby. Metatron rolled his eyes and rubbed the sore spot, noting that 2 were still missing. Raphael and Hellel had not arrived yet. Michael reported that their elder sister was inside the Ein Sof running diagnostics on the Sephirot. Gabriel asked where Raphael was. Raphael appeared silently behind them, running a mechanical hand through his short brown hair as a breeze from the distant tower billowed his white coat and braided tassels against his arm. He inspected the scene with a neutral expression and asked whether Uriel had a child. Sandalphon tried to suppress a laugh and Metatron snickered. Uriel sputtered and flushed, and the infant. in her arms cried even louder. Raphael suggested the child needed changing. At that, all the angels aside from Michael stepped back several paces. Uriel, annoyed, used telekinesis to levitate the child and asked if anyone knew how to change a diaper. Helo stepped out of a flash of dark light near Michael. She wore a white coat over a tailored black top and leggings with high slits, topped with black boots. Her snow-white hair and blue eyes gave her an imposing presence. Uriel gratefully noted that her sister had children and asked for help. Helo blinked and then, after a moment, took the infant and the supplies. In a few minutes she disposed of the waste, changed the child, and returned the quieted infant to Uriel, who cradled the child as it began to babble contentedly. Helo asked whether that child had been the only survivor. Uriel nodded solemnly. Helo declared that they should begin the meeting without delay. The sky above Erebos shimmered as a projection of Earth and the moon formed over the island's edge, a real-time holographic simulation floating in the air. Lights dotted the spinning globe to indicate populations of believers, with concentrations over places like the Vatican and the Middle East. Helo waved and made the globe turn, then fixed it on a single point marked by a large red. Metatron inferred that the meeting concerned the distress signal and massive power surge detected in Ukraine. Helo confirmed and explained that around 2,000 hours in Ukraine they had detected a large surge of power centered on one town. A second surge was only registered after the system recalibrated for the disturbance, and another was a brief blip. She noted that the town had been guarded by a single angel and a priest, and at first she had suspected an attack from another mythological pantheon, but the data did not support that. Raphael asked how sure she was. Helo replied that the Sephiroth was tuned to detect fluctuations in energy, including divine power, but what it had logged was completely unknown. The closest the system could match it to was the seed of entropy. The archangels murmured uneasily at that comparison. The baby in Uriel's arms whimpered, and Uriel calmed the child by letting it grasp her finger, which made the infant smile. Helo continued, reporting that the town had been erased by the time Uriel arrived. The landscape had been wiped clean, leaving a vast, unnatural void roughly the scale of a major city. Uriel confirmed the devastation and said that whatever had done it did not resemble forces they recognized. It had appeared as a living shadow with many wrong, uncanny aspects. Staring at it made her mind recoil. Raphael suggested that perhaps the underworld had been working on something unknown. Metatron pointed out that with beings like Ajuka Beelzebub among the devils, such possibilities could not be discounted. Uriel responded that she had not sensed any demonic power from the entity. Sandalphon proposed Azazel as a candidate, noting his experiments and the Grigori's research focus. Perhaps someone had found a way to craft a living weapon that operated outside normal demonic or holy power. Michael reminded them that Azazel had retreated early and seemed unlikely to seek another great war. Raphael offered another name, and the archangels stiffened at the mention. That name was Yam, the Canaanite deity of the abyss and the deep and ancient enemy from a time when their father had still stood among the Canaanite gods. The memory of that older conflict shivered through them. Michael's expression darkened as he declared that Yam had been sealed at the bottom of the Red Sea. The archangels questioned what Yam could possibly be doing in Ukraine and noted that the system had detected a power whose wavelength resembled the beast rather than Yam. They expected Yam's energy to register as divine. Raphael reminded them that it was only a possibility and cautioned them not to forget how dangerous Yam had been in the past, how her rage had nearly destroyed the Egyptian gods and the other gods of the Near East. Voices rose as the archangels all began to speak at once, and the commotion made the infant in Uriel's arms whimper. Uriel immediately moved to soothe the child, glancing toward her eldest sister, who had her eyes closed in deep thought. Helo raised a hand and released a wave of divine energy that calmed the room into silence. Helo believed they must continue to monitor the situation. She asked Uriel to confirm whether she had been able to kill the creature. Uriel, rocking the baby until she slept, affirmed that she had, and added that the creature had mentioned someone named Sophia before it died. Gabriel asked what it had said, and Uriel explained that it had mentioned Sophia, leading her to suspect that the creature had been after someone by that name and that this might explain why it had raised an entire town. Hello studied the information flowing across the screen and reported that the system held multiple records of people named Sophia who had been members of the church. She said she would investigate those records in her own time. Raphael asked if they really thought the creature had been searching for someone named Sophia, and Michael suggested that it was at least a starting point. Hello then outlined a plan. She directed Michael and Sandalphon to oversee exorcist training and to begin identifying potential sacred gear wielders to recruit. She tasked Raphael and the science division with developing ways to increase their numbers, noting that even with her leadership, their natural lifespans, and several system encodings, they were outnumbered, and this new threat required stronger defenses. When Metatron raised the question of the child, Uriel stiffened and tightened her hold protectively. She shot Metatron a sharp look that made him step back and raise his hands in a placating gesture. Metatron ventured that they could not seriously be thinking of raising the child in heaven. Uriel bristled and demanded what he meant. Metatron looked to the others for support. Some averted their eyes while others, like Sandalphon, shook their head. Raphael argued that heaven was not a safe place to raise a child, given the abundant holy energy and the unpredictable effects it could have on a human half. Uriel flared, heat and light building around her as her 12 wings spread wide. The other seraphim gave space, watching the confrontation with measured attention. Raphael met her gaze calmly despite the wave of warmth that washed over him, and Uriel accused him of heartlessness, insisting that she would not abandon an infant who had nowhere else to go and would become a target on Earth. Raphael rubbed his forehead in frustration and clarified that he had not said she had to abandon the child. He proposed a compromise. They could place the child in one of their secluded institutes on Earth, an orphanage in Europe that functioned quietly and would allow the child a peaceful life. Uriel relaxed as the flames around her subsided and listened to the suggestion. Sandalphon proposed that Uriel run the institute after its retiring director. Metatron reacted with incredulity, pointing out that Uriel was the commander of their forces and questioning whether they would let her abandon her duties to care for a child. Several seraphim echoed his concern. Uriel responded that she understood her responsibilities but would not be pushed into casting the child out. She asked Helel to decide. Helel took a moment before telling Uriel that she could go and raise the child, but she made it clear that Uriel must not shirk her duties. On days when Uriel could not come, she should arrange for someone to look after the child, and if she truly could not attend, she should find a seraph to cover for her temporarily. Uriel looked down at the infant, who babbled and gazed around with curiosity. Uriel nodded in agreement and pledged to uphold her obligations. Helel adjourned the meeting unless anyone had anything pressing to add. The other seraphim began to leave Erebos until only Helel, Sandalphon, Michael, and Uriel remained. As Uriel turned to leave, Sandalphon asked if she had named the child yet. Uriel admitted she did not know the name and suggested she could scan the infant's mind. Michael advised against intruding on the mind of a child, explaining that the minds of infants were particularly vulnerable to mental magic and could suffer ill effects. Helel folded her arms, her serious demeanor returning with the end of the meeting. Helel asked why Uriel did not name the child herself. Uriel replied that she was not the child's mother. Helel sighed, walked over, and placed a hand on Uriel's shoulder. Helel reminded Uriel that she was all the child had and that the child needed her more than ever. Uriel glanced down at the baby, who babbled happily, and admitted that naming the child felt like taking something from her. Michael assured Uriel that she was giving the child a new life and that the parents would be glad their child was safe. Uriel thought for a moment and chose the name Lucia. Sandalphon raised an eyebrow and repeated the name. Uriel explained that Lucia meant light, and hoped the child would grow bright. Helel smiled and said he had no doubt she would. 6 years later, a cool breeze swept through the mountain meadow and the grass rustled. The church maintained many facilities around the world, but only a few sat in a secluded paradise like this one. The place functioned as a quaint orphanage run by head matron Oriel Reed and also trained future exorcists. The orphanage had become warmer in tone since its new administration took over. The laughter of a child broke the stillness. A silver-haired young woman named Griselda hurried after a dark blur that zipped down the corridor, calling that she could not fly and asking Lucia to slow down. Lucia darted past nuns and priests, laughing as she raced down the hall. Some of the staff noted that Miss Lucia did not usually act like this and guessed that Lady Uriel must have returned from her meeting in heaven. Others expressed sympathy for Griselda. Lucia flapped her wings harder when she remembered her mother's promise to begin her training. Griselda panted but kept up. Lucia rounded a corner so quickly that she failed to see an obstacle and tumbled, caught before she hit the floor by a pair of steady arms. Uriel held Lucia, her stern green eyes softening as she watched her ward. Lucia greeted her sheepishly. Griselda, catching her breath, admitted she did not understand why Lucia was acting out of character. Uriel smiled and told Griselda that Lucia was still a child and it was good to see her behave her age. She thanked Griselda for watching over Lucia, acknowledging the young exorcist's other duties. Griselda stammered that it was an honor to protect a miracle child. Uriel called for Lucia to come along, and Lucia followed her mother's hand. As Uriel and Lucia walked away, Griselda listened to their easy banter and felt relieved for the break. The season seemed to be changing. The orphanage felt somehow warmer. Later, Uriel stood in a small clearing with her arms crossed and eyes closed, attentive to the creak of a nearby creek, the chirp of birds, and distant wolf calls. She opened her eyes when Lucia burst into the clearing, wings beating as she zipped from branch to branch with gleeful abandon. Lucia landed on a rock, launched herself again, and aimed a playful charge at her mother. Uriel fainted lightly. Lucia grabbed her mother's leg and used it to flip herself into a sweeping, playful maneuver meant to catch Uriel off guard. Uriel responded with a quick, controlled parry that sent Lucia tumbling into a nearby boulder. In a comically exaggerated way, the boulder crumbled into harmless rubble and dust, leaving Lucia dusty but otherwise unharmed. Lucia sat up, rubbing the back of her head and offering a small, defiant complaint that she had been knocked about. Uriel approached with concern and asked if Lucia was all right. Lucia beamed and insisted she was fine. Uriel smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm and declared that training for the day was over. The two sat on a large rock by the stream and watched birds swoop, snatching unsuspecting fish near the surface as sunlight danced across the water. Lucia ran to her backpack, reached inside, and pulled out 2 water bottles. She called for her mother. Uriel looked up from the stream as her daughter offered a bottle, smiled, took it, unscrewed the cap, and took a sip. She watched as Lucia eagerly drank from her own bottle. Lucia's training had begun when she was 6. It had consisted mostly of exercises a child could handle along with some basic combat skills. Uriel had tried to delay it, but Lucia had seen Griselda sparring with other exorcists at the compound and began begging until Uriel finally gave in. The results surprised her. The girl had a natural aptitude for combat. The thought made Uriel want to learn more about Lucia's biological parents, and she made a mental note to ask Raphael or Michael about which priest had been stationed in that town in Ukraine. Uriel praised Lucia for doing well and ruffled her black hair. Lucia excitedly asked if that meant she could start shooting light from her hands like Uriel, and rambled about wanting to imitate Zelda's sword techniques and Griselda's letter-based tricks. Uriel asked what Griselda had been showing her and considered asking Griselda to bring Lucia to the training grounds. Lucia complained that her mother had not shown her anything new. Uriel set boundaries, explaining that Lucia could not start learning light or other advanced techniques until she had the basics down and could not yet use holy power. Lucia begged to be taught. Uriel replied that maybe later, and Lucia, looking down and prodding the grass with her shoe, accused her of always saying that and lamented that Auntie Sandy or Uncle Raffi often took Uriel away. Uriel's expression softened. She stroked her daughter's head and asked why she wanted to learn so badly, reminding her that she had only just turned 7 and there was no need to rush. Lucia groaned. Uriel relented and agreed to begin teaching the basics slowly. Lucia's face lit up, but Uriel added stern limits. No light blasts, nothing dangerous, and no floating letters until the fundamentals were mastered. Lucia protested that it was not fair. Uriel pointed to a large boulder by the stream and proposed a challenge. She would teach Lucia how to make simple light weapons and miracles, but she would not teach anything more until Lucia could cut that boulder in half with pure holy power. Lucia turned to the boulder twice her size, clenched her tiny fists and nodded, declaring that she could do it and that she would be strong like her mother. She playfully vowed to make the rock go boom. Uriel smiled and ruffled her hair. Explained that angels use two types of power, holy or divine power and light power, both stemming from the same source inside an angel. She contrasted angels with humans and devils. Humans used spiritual power, magical power, or ki. Devils used demonic power. Angels used holy power, a form of divine power inherited from God. Uriel described holy power as the opposite of demonic power, saying it allowed angels to perform miracles to bless lands and objects, heal the sick, and destroy demons and creatures of darkness, while holy energy also enabled light power for creating objects and illusions. To demonstrate, she formed a translucent dove of light that circled Lucia's head. When Lucia reached for it, the dove dispersed into a shower of light particles and Lucia expressed awe and a strong desire to learn the technique. Uriel tapped the top of her head lightly and told her to be patient. Lucia rubbed her head and whined. Uriel then instructed Lucia on how to access her holy power to gauge its strength. She gestured for Lucia to sit and guided her to close her eyes and focus, explaining that as a miracle child she carried angelic blood and that learning to control it was like learning to control her breath. The body recognized it, but she had to learn to use it intentionally. Lucia closed her eyes and felt a warm, comforting presence settle inside her. A shimmering red aura emerged around her. Uriel smiled. The result matched her expectations. Lucia showed promise, though there was room for growth. Uriel encouraged her to draw the power out and form a ball between her hands, warning her not to force it but to will it so the holy power would flow naturally. Lucia furrowed her brow as the aura grew stronger and a light breeze rustled the grass. She took a deep breath, opened her hands, and produced a tiny marble-sized ball of red light above her palm. She gasped and jumped up to show her mother, calling out in excitement, but the marble of light soon dispersed into tiny sparkles and her excitement faded into disappointment. Uriel chuckled, patted her head, and reassured her that it would take time, but that one day she would be able to break that boulder in half. Uriel reminded Lucia to focus on the task and to remember nothing else until she could do it. Lucia nodded and concentrated on reforming the ball of light. Uriel told Lucia she could use the creek but she must go with Griselda whenever she did, because Uriel would be out handling something with Auntie Ellie and Uncle Mikey for the time being. Lucia agreed, not paying too much attention because of her excitement over her newfound powers. Uriel warned Lucia not to cause any explosions or try the floating letters until she could break the rock in half. Lucia looked up at her mother and promised that she would break it, begging her to watch and to teach her the floating letters and light magic when she returned from her grown-up errands. If anyone had asked Griselda Corda, as a 13-year-old exorcist fresh out of the academy, where she saw herself in 5 years, she would have said she planned to be the world's top exorcist serving under one of the seraphim, ideally Lady Hellel or Lady Gabriel. If someone had told her she would be assigned as the guard to the daughter of one of the 4 great seraphs with the job of making sure the child did not wander off, she would have laughed. Yet 4 years had passed since the church assigned her to this sleepy mountain town near the Alps, and 8 days had passed since Lady Uriel had returned to heaven. Griselda told Lucia that it was getting late and they should head back, brushing her silver hair aside. Lady Uriel had given the child a difficult task: break a rock in half using pure holy power. The rock had been reinforced with a thin layer of holy energy, making it far harder than it first appeared, and Griselda could sense the extra warding. Lucia huffed, sweat on her forehead, glaring at the rock with as much determination as a 7-year-old could muster. She insisted she could do it and asked Griselda to watch. A wispy red and black aura gathered around her. She pressed her hands together and then split them apart, forming a small crackling ball of holy power between her palms. She shouted as she launched the orb at the rock. The orb sped forward and struck the stone. Griselda whistled as an explosion shattered the quiet, raising a dust cloud that obscured the view. When the dust cleared, the rock remained intact, a small crater ringed with drawn water from the nearby stream. Lucia groaned in frustration and stamped the ground, demanding to know why the rock would not break. Griselda suggested she take a break and try again in the morning, placing a hand on the child's shoulder. Lucia puffed her cheeks and accused her mother of doing something to the rock. Griselda offered some candy, which Lucia took and ate immediately while grumbling that her mother was mean. Griselda reassured her that Uriel likely wanted her to work for it and that it would be too easy if the rock broke on the first try. Lucia stomped off with all the stubborn energy of a small child. She stopped and glared at the rock as if sheer will could make it shatter. Her longing to prove herself, to be taught how to be an angel, swelled inside her. As she stared, the world flickered for a moment as though a visual glitch had passed. Lucia blinked and the oddity vanished. Lucia asked Griselda if she had seen that. Griselda asked what Lucia meant and scanned their surroundings. She felt and saw nothing unusual, though her guard remained slightly raised. If Lucia could perceive something Griselda could not, she needed to stay alert. Lucia then asked for ice cream. Griselda reminded her that Lady Uriel had said not to buy too many sweets, but Lucia promised she would not tell. Griselda sighed and agreed to one treat, and Lucia grabbed Griselda's hand and pulled her out of the woods. The town near the churches institution was a small European hamlet that blended modern amenities with rustic countryside charm. The Alps rose in the distance, their peaks touching the edge of the sky, and rolling green hills surrounded the town. Old stone buildings stood beside newer wood and concrete structures, giving the place an air of history mixed with the present. Griselda stood in line at a park vendor while Lucia played with other children. She left the girl to herself, fighting the urge to groan when she overheard other mothers whispering about how young she looked and how it was odd for her to have charge of a child Lucia's age. She glanced up to check on Lucia. As usual, Lucia sat alone on the swings while the other children ran and played. Griselda thought she should mention to Uriel that Lucia needed peers her age to learn how to socialize. Being surrounded mostly by adults who could not fully relate to her needs was not ideal for her upbringing. The vendor called the next customer, and Griselda ordered 2 chocolate ice creams before walking over to Lucia, who swayed listlessly on the swing. Griselda handed Lucia an ice cream and asked if she did not want to play with the other kids. Lucia shook her head while eating and said she did not think the other children liked her. Griselda asked whether Lucia had tried talking to them. Lucia admitted she had shown the other children a worm and they had all run away. Griselda nearly winced and cautioned that showing worms was not the best way to make friends. Lucia continued to eat her ice cream and said she did not need friends. Lucia insisted that Zelda and Mama were enough for her. Griselda sighed that kids needed friends and ruffled Lucia's hair. The girl continued eating her ice cream without a care. If Lucia could smile outside of training, maybe she would make some friends. Griselda urged them to go home. Lucia nodded and hopped off the swing to follow her. As she moved, her eyes throbbed and the world seemed to glitch. Lucia looked at her ice cream and saw something odd. In her vision, an appraisal identified the object as chocolate ice cream and listed cacao and vanilla extract among its ingredients. Lucia tugged on Griselda's sleeve and excitedly pointed out the words floating around the cone. Griselda misread the gesture as an offer to share and joked that such generosity was a blessing. Lucia protested that the words and some numbers were actually hovering in the air. Griselda pretended not to see, but the nearby parents' whispers made her decide it was best to go home and have Lucia checked. In the Church Institute infirmary, Lucia sat on an examination chair, liking her ice cream while a middle-aged priest approached with a light and an ophthalmoscope. Griselda asked if anything was wrong. The priest explained that there appeared to be nothing physically wrong at first glance and wondered if Lucia might be pretending. Griselda replied that Lucia did not seem like the sort to play pretend. The priest then mentioned that Lucia was a miracle child and might have awakened a sacred gear. He fetched a small detector from a cabinet and waved it around Lucia while she ate. The device registered a positive reading, and the priest concluded that his second hunch was correct. The priest offered to identify the gear then and there. He asked Lucia whether she still saw words and numbers around him and around Miss Corda. Lucia nodded and told him that the name floating over him read Ferdinand Giordano. Griselda suggested asking something else, and Ferdinand asked what more Lucia could see. Lucia's eyes changed as she focused. The dark of her pupils lightened to a pale violet pink and her irises swirled with white, pink, and purple. Her vision generated data on Griselda Corda, The appraiser could not estimate an overall combat level and several attributes were unreadable, but it displayed age 19, female, human, single, with the special trait natural holy sword wielder and current equipment listed as Failnacht and a light sword. Ferdinand judged that this matched a low-tier defensive sacred gear commonly referred to as warning system, but more accurately called appraisal. He explained that the gear displayed information like a heads-up display but did not tell the user how to act on that information. Griselda asked why it was considered low-tier, and Ferdinand elaborated that an appraisal only presents facts. It does not guide decisions, and it often cannot assess people far stronger than the user. He expressed concern that Lucia, having awakened a gear so young, might suffer sensory overload. Griselda resolved to inform Lady Uriel. Ferdinand inquired about Lucia's dreams. Griselda answered that the bad dreams had not been frequent lately and laughed that Lucia had once jokingly told her the child would have blue hair. Lucia suddenly ran over to Griselda and announced that her level was 125, beaming with excitement. Griselda praised her and said they would rest and that tomorrow they would begin practicing together by the creek. Lucia grabbed Griselda's hand and waved goodnight to Ferdinand before they left. That night Lucia giggled as she lay in bed and held her hand out toward the ceiling. She clenched her fist and thought that if she became stronger, she could be a cool angel like her mother and defeat all the monsters in her dreams. Her mother said they were just dreams, but monsters felt real to her. Griselda had teased that one might steal her socks if she did not sleep on time. Still, Lucia imagined that with her new ability she would be able to stand up to them. Her lips curved into a small smile as she called out her status to the system. The display answered, estimated combat level, strength, 30, speed, 25, durability, 20, magic, 20, skill, total combat capabilities calculated to be age, 7, race, Nephilim, gender, female, marital status, single. Special trait, Twilight reincarnation. Equipment, warning system, balance. Lucia giggled at the number and thought that 125 sounded like a lot. She decided she had to get stronger to protect Zelda and Mama from monsters. She slid out of bed and crossed to her desk, opening a drawer to pull out a notebook. Lucia flipped past childish scribbles and homework until she stopped at a page with a crude drawing. A tall, shadowy figure with 2 white circles for eyes. She picked up a black crayon and began coloring, humming as she labeled the picture the epilogue. Satisfied, she drew herself firing lightning bolts at the looming shadow and added 2 more stick figures. Before Griselda could make her evening rounds, Lucia left the notebook open and scrambled back onto her bed. A new doodle had been added across the pages, a stick figure boy with brown hair and a red arm battling a group of girls. Nearby stood the stick figure of Lucia beside 6 others, and one figure stood out next to her, a girl with long red hair. A small explosion rocked the creek shoreline, throwing up dust and smoke in a theatrical burst. When the air cleared, the rock still loomed as if daring her. Lucia shrieked in frustration, stamped her foot, and puffed her cheeks. Her wings flapped in annoyance as she pointed at the stubborn stone. She demanded of Griselda why the rock had not been destroyed yet. Griselda looked up from her book and suppressed a chuckle at the unbroken boulder. Lucia scanned the rock, and the system generated object data. Generating object data? Composed of silicon, oxygen, potassium, carbon, and iron. Special trait, low-class holy barrier. Lucia stomped again and told her mother she hated the rock. Griselda suggested that Lady Uriel likely did not intend the stone to be easy to break and that Lucia might simply need to try harder. Lucia grumbled and then, distracted, confessed that she wanted ice cream. Griselda reminded her that she had had ice cream the day before and warned about cavities, offering baby carrots as a healthier snack instead. Lucia made a disgusted face at the thought of the carrots, which only amused Griselda more. Griselda proposed a deal. Eat 1 pack of baby carrots back at the institute and she would give Lucia some allowance to buy ice cream from the ice cream man later. Lucia frowned, considered the choice, and then agreed reluctantly. Griselda praised her and teased that perhaps the carrots would help Lucia's holy powers so she could finally break the rock in half. Lucia protested that she was not a baby and declared proudly that she was a big girl who no longer wrote to Santa as she followed Griselda back to the institute. Later, Father Ferdinand called Lucia's name to bring her back to attention in class. He tapped the chalkboard where a diagram showed a pale man in Victorian-era clothing with pointed ears, an illustration of vampires. Lucia balanced her pencil on her upper lip but struggled to focus. Ferdinand reminded her to pay attention and to remember what he had said about her sacred gear. Lucia muttered that the system knew as much as she did, mostly basic facts Grandpa had provided. Ferdinand slapped his forehead and asked her not to refer to God in that way while at the institution. As the lesson continued, Ferdinand emphasized the essentials. Vampires were creatures of darkness who had existed since ancient times. He explained that vampires fed on humans by drinking their blood and then went on to teach how to combat them, asking if she wanted to be as capable as Griselda or Lady Uriel. Lucia straightened and focused. Ferdinand explained the common weaknesses of vampires: vulnerability to the sun, an inability to cross open water, incapacity to enter buildings without being invited, and that a stake to the heart could kill them. Ferdinand explained that, as a Nephilim, Lucia was naturally stronger against vampires because of her holy power. Lucia wrote the words down as best as she could. He warned that she still needed to be careful, since vampires had powers of their own, control over shadows and mist, and the ability to influence rats and bats. Lucia commented that the rats part did not sound very appealing, and Ferdinand muttered a rueful remark about children these days before continuing his lesson. The doors swung open, interrupting Ferdinand, and Lucia sprang out of her chair and ran from the classroom. Ferdinand pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed in frustration at her sudden exit. Lucia hurried toward the stairwell and, halfway down, saw her mother accompanied by an unfamiliar man. A dozen thoughts crowded her mind, but the strongest was the simple conclusion that this man must be her mother's boyfriend. He appeared older, with a scruffy beard and auburn hair, violet eyes, a gray trench coat over black clerical vestments. He spoke politely to Uriel and introduced himself as willing to assist in training the exorcists while on temporary assignment. Uriel smiled and reassured him that the place should be treated more like a place of rest than a military base, promising it was not like the Sigurd Institution in northern Germany, and expressing trust in his capabilities as one of the church's top exorcists. The man, Tuji, demurred modestly and said it would be an honor to work alongside her. Uriel mentioned that he had a daughter and hoped their daughters would get along. Tuji nodded and explained that Irina had been closed off since their move and struggled to make friends because of language barriers. The little girl poked her head out from behind Tuji's leg and addressed him. She strongly resembled her father, with chestnut brown hair and violet eyes, and she looked at Uriel with awe before rushing forward and hugging her mother tightly. Uriel registered that Lucia had been having lessons with Ferdinand, and Lucia admitted she had heard them arriving. Uriel told Lucia that Griselda had reported Lucia had unlocked a sacred gear. Lucia nodded excitedly. Her eyes shifted color as she ran a quick scan of her mother. Her internal warning system displayed Uriel's profile: age 500,000 years, race angel, gender female, marital status single, special trait great seraph, archangel, current equipment Shahadaku of Uriel. Uriel raised an eyebrow at the warning and asked if Lucia had made any progress with the rock. Lucia's face turned bratty and she kicked her mother in the shin in mock indignation, complaining that the shield around the rock made it unfair. Uriel rubbed her shin and smiled, teasing that she had never promised to make it easy. Lucia protested, wings fluttering in a childish display of annoyance, and Uriel reminded her to calm down because they had guests. Lucia's eyes scanned the newcomers. The man's reading returned as unreadable, outside her level. She noted his profile: Tuji Shidu, age 37, human, male, married to Rika Shidu, special trait holy sword wielder, equipment aim no habakiri. She could not read him. She turned her attention to the girl and felt a jolt of recognition. This girl matched the one from her dreams. Lucia eagerly scanned Irina's stats: strength 20, speed 25, durability 17, magic 5, skills 20, average combat level calculated to 87, age 7, race human, gender female, marital status listed as unrequited. Puzzled by the marital status line, Lucia asked what unrequited meant in the context of marriage. Tuji and Uriel exchanged amused looks. Tuji burst into laughter at Lucia's confusion, clutching his sides. Irina blushed, struck her father's leg, and demanded that he stop. Tuji winced as she playfully pounded his leg and apologized through his laughter. Tuji introduced himself properly as an exorcist from the United Church of Christ in Japan who had recently moved with his family, and he presented Irina to Lucia. He expressed the hope that the two girls would become friends. Irina looked at Lucia nervously, while Lucia stood with a reserved expression that contrasted sharply with her animated behavior around Uriel. Uriel gave Lucia a light pat on the back, and the gesture startled Lucia into introducing herself as Lucia Reed. Lucia greeted the others politely. Her greeting brought a small, shy smile to Irina's lips. Irina introduced herself as Irina Shidu and stammered that she had never met an angel before. Uriel suggested that Lucia take Irina to the park and offered money from a storage circle so they could buy ice cream and candy. Lucia's eyes lit up at the thought of sweets. As she reached for the euros, Uriel pulled back for a moment and adopted a stern expression that made both Lucia and Irina shrink a little. Uriel reminded Lucia to buy snacks for Irina and to share. Lucia nodded and held her hands out expectantly. Uriel sighed, placed the money in Lucia's hands, and said that Griselda would accompany them. She warned the girls not to wander too far and to be back before sunset. Lucia promised they would return, then surprised Irina by taking her hand and leading her out of the institution. Irina did not know what to make of Lucia Reed. She had imagined angels from the Bible as strong, kind heroes of justice, but Lucia presented an odd contrast. At the park, Lucia kept to herself and did not join the other children, leaving Irina awkwardly attempting to bridge the language barrier. After several minutes, Irina returned to sit beside Lucia, who was staring intently at a line of ants marching along the pavement. Irina asked if Lucia wanted to play on the swings, and Lucia declined. Griselda came over, placed a gentle hand on Irina's shoulder, and explained that Lucia was not used to talking to kids her age and could be very shy. Lucia felt a twinge of guilt at Irina's downcast expression. She looked at the swings, then back at Irina, and invited her to go on them. Irina brightened and nodded. Griselda warned them to be careful and not to swing so high they might jump off. Lucia agreed, and she and Irina sat on the swings. They swung in an awkward silence at first. Lucia had never spoken much with someone her own age. She had been homeschooled and trained rather than attending a typical school. Faced with an actual peer, she struggled to find the right words. Then Lucia asked if Irina liked magic. Irina answered that she did, surprised that Lucia had started a conversation. Lucia, suddenly excited, asked if Irina wanted to see something cool. She clasped her hands and produced a small red and black orb of holy light that hovered between her palms before dispersing into a shower of red sparkles. Lucia explained that her mother was teaching her how to use her holy powers, and she grew a little more confident. Irina admired Lucia like a superhero and asked if she could do more. Lucia smiled and, feeling the warm flutter of making a friend, began to show Irina other gentle demonstrations with the ball of light. From a nearby bench, Griselda watched with a soft smile as the two girls opened up to one another. Lucia was quieter than during training, but Irina's animated responses brought out emotions Griselda rarely saw outside of those sessions. The girls soon giggled, hopped off the swings, and ran together around the playground. Uriel sat with the reports Tuji had delivered, hand to her chin as she reviewed the files. One reason she had asked for Tuji's presence was to discuss the incident in Ukraine 7 years earlier. Registry searches had identified a priest named Noah Camillo as the priest stationed in the town where the devastation had occurred. Few officials at the Vatican had interacted with him, since he had been reassigned from Japan to Italy and then to Ukraine. Uriel confirmed that the files Tuji presented contained all of Noah's records from the UCCJ and his seminary days through his service as an exorcist at the Vatican. She noted that they had records from his time in the Vatican but nothing from his years in Japan, and she rued the administrative complications Gabriel's decisions had introduced among human religious institutions. Tuji suggested not placing all the blame on Gabriel, but Uriel warned not to be deceived by Gabriel's serene appearance, calling her shrewd and politically adept. As Uriel opened Noah's file, she remarked on his appearance, wondering if he had dyed his hair, since the shape of his face and eyes resembled Lucia's. Tuji explained that hair dye was a common form of youthful rebellion in Japan. Tuji observed that Lucia looked like Noah, and Uriel said that Noah could possibly be Lucia's father. Tuji reacted with surprise. Uriel clarified that she had not borne a child with him. Rather, she had raised Lucia as her own. She recounted finding Lucy in the ruined town shortly after receiving a distress signal. There had been a devastated landscape and Lucia had been found encased within a holy barrier, suggesting that either Noah or the angel connected to him had ensured her survival. Uriel flipped through the files and glanced at a photo of her daughter on her desk. Tuji absorbed the information and acknowledged his understanding. Tuji told Lady Uriel that he believed it had been for the best that she took the child in, noting the smile on Uriel's face. Realized what? Tuji explained that children tended to be a blessing to their parents and that he believed the girl would be good for her. Uriel paused and then said that the girl was already good to her. Even if someone else had given birth to her, Uriel had raised her, and she was just as much her daughter. After 7 years, Uriel could not imagine life without her. Tuji asked whether the girl knew she was adopted. Uriel nodded and said she had figured it out a while back but did not know who her biological parents were. She was content because Uriel was the only mother she had ever known. Tuji smiled and mentioned that Kamiyo-san had a younger sister in Japan, a first year at Ryukyu Academy in Kyoto, who had been looking into what happened to her brother since they lost contact. He reported that the Vatican had offered condolences but she did not accept what had happened and was investigating the matter, and that it would only be a matter of time before she stumbled onto something that could put her in danger. Uriel leafed through a file and found a photograph of Togame Kamiyo. She observed that Togame greatly resembled her daughter in looks, down to hair and eye color, though Lucia's hair had a violet tinge rather than being pitch black like Togame's. Tuji cleared his throat as Uriel gushed that her daughter might grow up to be a world-class beauty. He felt slightly awkward witnessing a parent's pride from an outside perspective. Uriel closed the folder and said she needed to contact Noah's family and hoped to arrange a meeting between Lucia and her biological aunt and grandparents. In the meantime, she asked Tuji to help Griselda with training, noting that despite being young, Griselda had much to learn about training others. A bespectacled priest suddenly burst through the doors, calling for Lady Uriel and panting with exhaustion. He bore a few scratches and a small bruise on his neck from a recent scuffle, and he struggled to speak. Uriel raised a hand to calm him and asked him to catch his breath. The priest reported that vampires had spilled out from a local skirmish between the Carmilla and Teeps factions. The combatants had scattered, and most of the stragglers had been dealt with, but one vampire was still loose in the area. He added that the exorcists had been mobilized but had not yet found the remaining vampire. Tuji's eyes widened at the news and he pointed out that the children were still in town. Uriel stood up quickly, her jaw tightening, and pressed a finger above her left ear to activate a small red cross contained within a circle. She called for Griselda and identified herself. Griselda answered and Uriel ordered her to bring Lucia and Irina back to the institution immediately. Griselda acknowledged the order but then, with alarm in her voice, reported that the girls had disappeared. Lucia had led Irina away from Griselda's watchful eye because she wanted to show her friends something at the creek. Irina asked whether they were sure they were supposed to go there, but she was excited to see it. Ever since Lucia had demonstrated some of her holy abilities, Irina had felt thrilled at the thought of learning more and possibly using such powers herself. She knew her father could fight monsters and be a hero, and the possibility of following a similar path felt within reach. Lucia assured Irina that she knew the way to the creek and insisted it would be worth the trip. She said she could even channel holy power now. Irina smiled at the fire in Lucia's eyes. She had not expected Lucia to warm up so quickly, but the two had bonded over their shared fascination with powers. At the shoreline, Lucia explained that her mother had promised to teach her more if she could break a rock with holy power. Irina asked whether she could learn magic too, noting that her father was a priest and suggesting she might learn holy miracles while staying there. Lucia answered that it was possible and that if they learned, They could go out and fight monsters together, like the epilogue Lucia had seen in her dreams. Lucia described the epilogue as a giant shadowy monster she had imagined and claimed that what she saw in her dreams tended to come true most of the time. Irina asked what would happen to her in the future and whether she would become a hero of justice. Lucia thought for a moment and said she had seen a girl who looked like Irina among the adults in her visions. It might be Irina when she grew up, though most of the people in those dreams were grown-ups. Lucia's determination showed on her face as she said that when she became older she wanted to be a strong angel like her mother and one day defeat the epilogue. Lucia announced that she wanted to break the rock, and she asked Irina to be her apostle. Irina stumbled over the word and Lucia explained that an apostle was an exorcist paired with an angel, demonstrating by gathering a shimmer of holy power into her hands and aiming it at the stone. They imagined fighting the epilogue and the shadows together, comparing themselves to superheroes, and Lucia's eyes lit up with childlike stars. As the two girls plotted their futures with childish glee, neither noticed a pair of red eyes watching from the shadows. A deep hunger rested in those eyes, and the figure in the dark liked its lips, revealing sharp teeth. High above the compound, Uriel paced, biting her bottom lip. The sun had set hours earlier and bands of exorcists were searching the town for her daughter and for Tuji's party. With both Lucia and Irina missing, Griselda and Tuji had volunteered to lead the search while Uriel scoured the town from above. The remaining exorcists kept their distance. In this state, no one could predict how the archangel might lash out. Ferdinand advised her to remain calm, reminding her that Griselda and Tuji were among the finest exorcists available and that it had only been 2 hours. Uriel demanded how 2 7-year-old girls could evade 2 teams of skilled exorcists for so long. Her wings flared and holy power rolled through the hall, shaking the building and setting the chandelier to rattling. Ferdinand urged patience and faith in the search parties. The doors swung open. Griselda entered with a smear of blood on her cheek and something dragged behind her. Tuji followed with a grim expression. Uriel turned, narrowing her green eyes when she saw what Griselda had brought. Griselda explained that they had found another survivor hiding in the inn and tossed a pale man wearing lavish, old-fashioned clothing into the center of the room. The man groaned and went even paler under Uriel's penetrating gaze. The pressure of her presence made each breath feel heavy. Uriel remarked that there had been more survivors than expected. The exorcist who had reported earlier stiffened. Uriel asked if this was the last one, and Tuji replied that he had killed 2 others hiding in the inn and that Griselda had reported killing another before this. There might still be others unaccounted for in town. Uriel regarded the captive with cold disdain, reached forward, and gripped the back of his scalp, pulling his hair hard. The man stammered that he was a proud member of House Manther and warned that harming him would invite war from the Teeps faction. Uriel responded that if that was the case, then so be it, and Ferdinand urged that they focus on the matter at hand. Uriel released her hold and demanded to know why vampires were in her territory, reminding him that the area was under heaven's jurisdiction and questioning whether Vlad Teeps would be foolish enough to invite a heavenly war while already engaged with the Carmilla faction. She paced around him, her steps leaving faint scorch marks. The Manther vampire trembled. He had never felt such fear, not against Carmilla's forces nor vampire hunters. He protested that they had not meant for their fight to spill into Uriel's domain, claiming they had been ambushed by forces loyal to Ursabit Bathory. Uriel asked if there were more of them. He answered that the human defenders had killed the rest. When she asked if he had seen 2 girls, one with black hair and one with orange-brown hair, he denied it, then foolishly boasted that he would not hesitate to harm a child of the church. Uriel's expression hardened and she warned him that she would let him die with that knowledge. She threatened that if there was a single injury on the girls, she would reduce Romania to a smoldering crater and eliminate every vampire. Before he could reply, Uriel unleashed a sudden, focused burst of holy light that engulfed him. The flash was intense and absolute. When it faded, he lay motionless where he had stood. The exorcists watched in grim silence as the archangel had dispensed swift and merciless judgment. Uriel let the lifeless body fall to the floor and turned to the others, fury blazing in her green eyes. She ordered every exorcist in the compound to expand the search, move out to the surrounding towns, and execute any vampires found on sight without mercy. A command was given to find the girls and leave no survivors. Her 12 wings spread from her back before she vanished in a pillar of red flames. Lucia panicked as she and Irina ran through the woods, worrying that their mothers and fathers would be furious for being out so late. The two had lost track of time while playing by the creek. With Irina's encouragement, Lucia had been showing off her newfound powers, though she was still clumsy with them. 4 hours she had hurled spheres of holy power at a shielded rock, creating bigger and bigger explosions while the rock barely budged. After that, they had spent an hour skipping stones across the stream. They blamed each other for not keeping track of time and bickered while trying to find their way back, but the fading light beneath the canopy made the path confusing. Lucia asked if they had passed a particular spot, and Irina, on the verge of tears, said she wanted her dad. Lucia tried to steady her friend by reminding her that they were heroes and had to be brave so they could fight the shadows and the epilogue together. Irina sniffled and nodded, and Lucia held her hand tightly, trying to keep herself calm despite her own fear of being lost. The mist thickened as they pushed deeper into the woods. Lucia squinted and said she could hardly see. Irina stayed close. When a twig snapped nearby, both girls spun around. A tall shadow stood between 2 trees. Lucia stepped protectively in front of Irina as the figure moved into the dim moonlight. The man was unnaturally pale, with pointed ears and matted blonde hair. He wore an older-style military uniform with a short, tattered red cape. 2 small fangs peeked from his upper lip. Lucia's eyes shifted, and a silent readout in her vision identified him as Balthazar Vladi and assessed his power as far exceeding theirs. Balthazar liked his lips and let his hunger show as he addressed them. Lucia glared at him and said nothing. He mocked her fierce expression and turned his attention to Irina, encouraging the girls to be polite and to trust him. He introduced himself and offered his hand as an escort back to town. The girls stepped back, refusing to take his hand, and Balthazar's amusement faded into annoyance. He took another step forward, his demeanor hardening as his hunger rose and his intent to make them his prey became clear. Lucia fumbled in her pocket for something to think of a plan. She produced a small bottle and uncapped it. Before Balthazar could react, Lucia sprayed the contents at him. The holy liquid hit with an immediate effect. Balthazar screamed and recoiled, smoke rising where it struck. His clothes and cape smoldered in several places and his hair was singed. His face showed severe burn marks and one eye was scorched and clouded. He spat insults through the pain and vowed revenge. Lucia grabbed Irina's hand and ran deeper into the brush as Balthazar staggered to his feet, wounded but determined, and began to follow. Irina panted as they ran, asking where they were going. Lucia kept moving, pulling her friend through the trees. The mist seemed to close around them, and no matter how fast they ran, the forest still felt like it was swallowing the path behind them. The mist grew thicker as they continued moving, as if it had a mind of its own. The faint echo of bats chirped around them. Lucia warned that the vampire would eat them if he caught them, recalling Ferdinand's lessons that vampires drank blood and could be deadly. Irina paled and asked what they should do. Lucia urged them to run. They ran until fatigue slowed them and the trees began to blur into one another, as if they had been circling. At last they stopped in a small clearing. Balthazar taunted them from the shadows, calling them out and promising he was not angry. Irina whimpered and the two ducked behind bushes. Lucia covered Irina's mouth and her own to stifle their breathing. Footsteps passed nearby. Balthazar teased that they were playing hide and seek, then sniffed the air and murmured that the holy water was interfering with his senses. Lucia held her breath until the footsteps faded, then let out a quiet sigh and lowered her hand. Irina looked as if she might cry. Irina whispered that the monster would eat them, and Lucia tried to reassure her though she did not feel certain. Lucia ran through possibilities and then said she had an idea. She handed the bottle of holy water to Irina and showed a small ball of black and red light she had gathered, explaining that the holy water and the energy could hurt the creature. Irina asked how. Lucia began to answer but then froze when she heard breathing directly behind. She jumped and was seized by something. She struggled and was turned to face Balthazar Vladi, his face scarred and distorted by age and rot. He leaned close and sniffed her. Lucia demanded to be let go, and Balthazar replied that bad children deserved punishment, threatening her with cruel harm. Lucia thrashed harder, her panic giving way to a surge of energy. A flash of black and red light burst from her and struck Balthazar's hand, causing him to recoil and clutch it in pain. Balthazar cursed and kicked Lucia across the clearing. She slammed into a tree, the trunk shuddering, and painfully pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. As he closed in, Balthazar spoke of savoring her defeat and of having never encountered an angel before. A tense pause followed. Irina stepped forward, trembling but determined. Balthazar mocked her size and faith, then reached for her. Irina sprayed the remaining holy water across his face and hands. The vampire howled in agony, swatting blindly and striking Irina, who was sent sprawling. He reeled from the burning sensation on his face and cried out in pain. Balthazar threatened to deal with Irina next and to leave her helpless, his voice laced with menace. Lucia commanded him not to touch her friend. The command steadied her. A warm red aura began to flow from Lucia. She closed her eyes and drew holy power into herself, guided by her angelic nature. A long-dormant strength stirred and wisps of black and red energy formed in her hands, crackling with unstable power that even Balthazar felt. Lucia clenched her jaw and poured every ounce of strength into the energy. The sphere grew brighter and more turbulent. She spread her wings and launched herself toward Balthazar, moving with speed and determination. Balthazar fired a beam of red energy that barely missed as Lucia darted around him. She used a tree branch as a springboard, pushing off as the swirling ball of energy in her hands expanded, fed by her resolve. The shadows around them seemed to elongate before they were ripped and absorbed into a swirling ball of light. Balthazar hissed as he whipped his head around, trying to pinpoint Lucia's exact location. The hollow where his ear had been picked up the sound of a twig snapping, and he spun on his feet, firing a spear of crimson energy toward the noise. Lucia had already darted out of the trajectory. She twisted around the spear and drew her arm back, summoning a large orb of red and black light above her palm. She hurled the sphere at Balthazar, and he cried out in pain as it hit him and sent him careening through several trees like a ragdoll. A tremendous blast lit the night sky in a crimson glow and shook the woods. Lucia landed heavily, gasping as her power ebbed away. The wave from her final attack washed over her, uprooting small trees and rattling the larger ones. Exhaustion took hold, and she struggled to her feet, wincing. She looked over at Irina, who lay unconscious with a bruise forming on her. Lucia knelt and shook her gently, urging her to get up and telling her they needed to get home. With effort, Lucia supported Irina with one arm and tried to stand, mimicking the way exorcists carried the injured at the institution. Each step felt like she was dragging lead. She had barely managed a couple of paces when a familiar voice behind her chilled her blood. Balthazar limped toward them. A wispy shadow clung to his right arm, dotted with sparks of red light that flickered as if struggling to stay alight. He looked badly wounded. His clothes were in tatters and his skin showed fierce burn marks. Balthazar snarled threats of revenge and declared he would make Lucia pay. He hissed and transformed into a swarm of shadowy bats that swept toward the two girls. Lucia tightened her focus and gathered the red and black light to her palm, but Balthazar reformed into his physical body and dove at her with claws and fangs bared. Lucia braced herself and closed her eyes, ready to meet whatever came. A cry for help rose in her memory, a child's plea to her mother, but she opened her eyes to find Balthazar suddenly halted midair, frozen inches from her. Balthazar spat a bewildered curse. Before he could move properly, an invisible force slammed him against a tree and pinned him in place. Glowing spears of light held his remaining limbs to the bark, securing him so he could not break free. He roared in fury and frustration. White feathers rained down, and a vast, holy power flooded the clearing. The ground trembled and cracks spidered across the earth as wind whipped through the trees. Through the haze, Lucia poured more energy into her small orb until it swelled to the size of a basketball, a roiling mass of red and black. Lucia warned whoever had arrived to stay back. A woman stepped into view and, without flinching, moved through Lucia's burst of energy unscathed. She wrapped her arms around Lucia and spoke calmly, insisting that Lucia was safe and that she should stop fighting. A familiar scent, lavender and shampoo, calmed Lucia, and the haze in her vision cleared. She realized she was looking into the warm green eyes of her mother. Lucia whispered her mother's name. The crackling black and red light around her faded as she relaxed. Uriel soothed her, calling her by the nickname she used when Lucia was small and stroking her back. Lucia murmured that she had been brave, and Uriel affirmed it before Lucia, exhausted, slipped into unconsciousness in her mother's arms. Uriel smiled gently and glanced at the unconscious Irina before turning her attention to the vampire pinned to the tree. Her eyes glowed softly as she beckoned him with a single finger. The force that had held him snapped, and he was pulled free and dragged toward Uriel by an unseen hand. In a voice that was quiet but carried menace, Uriel asked which family he belonged to. Balthazar made a last-ditch, vulgar retort that Uriel cut off. She pressed a fingertip to his chest and sent a searing surge of radiant energy through him. The pain racked him, and he cried out, then blurted the name of his house, the Vladi family. Uriel considered the confession with cool interest and remarked that the conflict should not spill into other borders. She noted she might have to speak with Vlad and Ursabit about boundaries. Balthazar whimpered for mercy as the sense of impending defeat closed in. There would be no mercy tonight, Uriel stated, and she turned away. With a snap of her fingers, a wave of purifying light washed over him. He screamed as the light consumed him. His form convulsed once, then collapsed, dissolving into ash that scattered on the wind. Uriel crossed back and gently scooped Irina into her other arm. She studied Lucia for a moment and recognized the source of the earlier power. The sensation, she thought, was unmistakable Lelial. She gathered the two girls and, ready to leave the devastated clearing, began to lead them away. She told them to go home as she vanished in a swirl of red flames, leaving behind only a faint scattering of embers where Balthazar had stood. An infinite expanse of stars greeted her when she opened her eyes. Galactic nebulae swirled, forming a vast tree whose height and roots extended into infinity. Above her and the immeasurably large tree hovered a golden black object resembling a star. Its corona formed a four-point crown that bathed the cosmic background in a rainbow of lights. 9 lesser lights shone above her, outshining the countless lights that made up the tree's trunk. The 9 lights glittered and orbited the canopy of the tree, whose boughs held an immeasurable number of stars. She realized there were 10 when she whispered that number to herself. She gazed down into boundless darkness, a depthless sea that swallowed flickering lights falling from the tree. One of 9 monstrous shadows lay beneath that roiling sea of darkness, its shifting surface sending waves that crashed against the trunk of the tree, producing colors her mind could not fully comprehend. She stepped back and bumped into something she could not see. A flickering light, similar to those above, hovered behind her, and she wondered at its presence. From the sea below, the shadows rose, 9 in total. Their voices spoke and whispered, but their words were unintelligible. She gripped the side of her head to block the noise when the flickering light behind her extended a soft multicolored ray and gently wrapped around her. A soothing voice entered her mind, telling her that the gap between them and tomorrow grows ever larger. The voice sounded very familiar, but before she could place it, a rush of visions flowed through her visions like the dreams she had been having. She saw the boy with the red gauntlet and girls at his side. One figure stood out among them all, glowing like a beacon even brighter than the boy. Crimson-red hair was all she could see. The vision shifted drastically to a burning wasteland and the red-haired girl whose hair was slowly turning white as the scene faded. The first thing Lucia awoke to was yelling. She shot up in bed, panting, a trail of cold sweat trickling down her forehead and dripping onto the blanket. Uriel called her name and checked her for wounds. Lucia looked around, still groggy from the sudden nap. The familiar wallpaper, scattered stuffed animals, and books came back into focus as she noticed her mother's worried face and Helel standing nearby in black and white clothing. Lucia mumbled Lucia at her mother, confused. Uriel reassured her that it was her and that she was safe now, pulling her daughter into a hug. Hello told Lucia that her sudden nap had everyone worried for a moment. Lucia panicked and grabbed Uriel's shoulders, insisting that they had to go get Irina because she had been hurt. Uriel explained calmly that Irina was fine, that she had woken a few hours earlier and had been sitting in Lucia's room for some time. Irina had only gone to get a drink of water. Lucia insisted she had seen the pale man, the vampire, but Uriel reassured her that Irina was okay and promised as she stroked her daughter's hair. The day's events finally caught up with Lucia. The fear and anxiety she had been holding in broke through. She hugged her mother tightly and began to cry, apologizing for not listening. Uriel soothed her, rubbing circles along her back and petting the spine of her wings until Lucia calmed. Hello exchanged a glance with Uriel and they silently agreed to discuss their earlier argument later. After Hello left and Lucia's tears subsided, Irina returned to the room with Tuji. The two girls embraced each other fiercely for a few minutes more, and Uriel watched with a small smile, glad that Irina had broken through her daughter's usual stoic facade. Uriel thought about the future and their recent argument. Now that she could not negotiate with the vampires in Romania, her focus had to be on making sure Lucia had what she needed to defend herself. She realized the resemblance between Lucia's latent power and Lelial, a power of God miracle belonging to the Angel of Night, Layla, and lamented that she had not seen it sooner. Training would be necessary. It was time, however reluctantly, to take some of the protection off her daughter. Lucia suddenly renewed her excitement and asked if she could make Irina her apostle, pleading with giddy energy. Irina nodded, eyes bright and hopeful. Uriel told Irina to ask her father. Irina begged her father to let her become an apostle, and Tuji, awkward and put on the spot, suggested they ask Uriel first. Irina visibly deflated at that answer, but Lucia quickly cheered that they only needed Uriel's agreement, imagining they could keep playing and become superheroes when they grew up. Irina agreed, and the two returned to their innocent, childlike conversation of heroes and villains. Uriel asked Tuji to watch the girls while she had things to discuss with her older sister. She did not have to walk far before seeing Hello waiting around the corner, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed. Hello asked if Lucia was okay, and Uriel explained that someone wanted Tuji Shidu's daughter to become her apostle. Uriel had told them to ask Tuji, but she preferred they wait until Lucia could properly control her holy power, perhaps in a few months. Hello fell into step beside her as they walked down the hallway and reminded Uriel that she could not shelter Lucia forever. Hello said that Lucia was Uriel's daughter and would play a big role on the world stage as the child of the Archangel Uriel. Uriel replied that Lucia was just a kid and that she wanted her to enjoy childhood and not be moved into the world while it teetered on the edge of war. Hello clarified that she had not suggested training Lucia as a soldier, but insisted that Lucia could not remain ignorant of the world indefinitely. Hello asked whether the miracle had been Lelial, and Uriel nodded stiffly. Hello noted that it was fitting for the daughter of the Angel of Night to inherit the ability to control holy light infused with darkness, but warned that such a power could be dangerous without proper control. Uriel fell silent for a moment before admitting that Hello was right, but that she still wanted to keep her daughter close a little longer. Uriel confessed that she and Hello had never had a childhood and that she wanted to give that to Lucia. Hello acknowledged that Uriel did not need to take Lucia's childhood away but urged her not to let the girl be naive about the world, since Uriel would not always be there to guide her. When Uriel asked about Lucia's dreams, those that seemed to come true, Hello replied that Lucia being a prophet was unlikely. Hello explained that the Sephirot recorded the names of all prophets past, present, and future, and that she had not seen Lucia's name in the system. Hello added that it was a hunch worth looking into, then told Uriel to go be with her daughter and warned her not to declare war on Romania before vanishing in a flurry of violet feathers. Uriel sighed and watched as Lucia and Irina ran past, chasing each other down the stairs toward the institution. She decided to postpone difficult decisions and lingered on the upstairs balcony to watch them play. For tonight and the next, Lucia would still be a child, and Uriel resolved to protect her innocence as long as she could. Even when Lucia stood on her own and chose her path, Uriel intended to stand behind her, ready to catch her if she ever fell. Lucia burst through the double doors of the institution as sunlight streamed through the windows. Irina, dressed in training gear and carrying a wooden sword, waved with a bubbly grin and warned that they would be late. Lucia tied her hair back and hurried after her friend. It had been 1 year since that fateful incident, and Lucia had turned 8. At the training ground, the sound of blades striking and hurried footsteps filled the air as several exorcists gathered to watch. Uriel observed the sparring from the sidelines alongside Griselda and Tuji. The two girls circled the ring, trading blows with wooden swords, and the assembled trainees murmured about Lucia's performance and the surprising skill of the challenger. Irina slid backward from the force of Lucia's strike but planted her wooden sword in the dirt to steady herself. She met Lucia's dark gaze and smiled, a cold, calculated calm in her eyes that differed from Lucia's usual stoicism. Irina thought that her father had been right. Lucia was strong. She spread her feet, steadied her grip, and readied herself. Lucia's eyes widened at Irina's change in posture, then she tightened her hold and advanced. The two clashed, and the force of their blows sent gusts of wind through the arena. Uriel watched with admiration and told Tuji that she was impressed at how well Lucia was doing under his training. Tuji nodded with quiet pride and confirmed that Irina had no prior formal training. Griselda mused that Lucia must have latent talent to reach this level after only 10 months of training. Red light flared around Lucia's wooden sword as she launched a powerful slash that Irina blocked. Dust erupted from the impact, and Irina used the cloud to leap free and bring her blade down. Lucia pressed forward with a series of precise moves that Irina narrowly avoided. The two locked blades and pushed against each other until Irina landed a solid blow to Lucia's midsection that knocked the air from her lungs and sent her reeling. Irina felt for a moment that she had the advantage. She lunged with a rapid series of attacks as orange light wrapped around her blade. Lucia's eyes flashed open and she parried the strikes with swift counters, then surged forward in a flurry of slashes. Irina slid back but held her ground, adopting a quick-draw stance to meet Lucia head-on. Another cloud of dust rose as the two collided, sending wind billowing across the field. Tuji asked Uriel whether she planned to teach Lucia basic miracles soon. Uriel confirmed that she would. She explained that Lucia's control over holy power and her innate power of God had been deeply refined over the past 10 months. Since Lucia was determined to make Irina her apostle, Uriel said that they would perform the ritual later that night. Uriel chuckled that Lucia had already been poring over books behind her back after Uriel had mentioned them. Griselda teased that Lucia had been sneaking books, and Uriel brushed the idea aside. Uriel sputtered and flushed at the suggestion. Lucia burst from the dust, drawing her wooden sword and pointing it toward Irina's face. Griselda called out that the match was over, stopping them. Lucia lowered her sword and panted, noting that Irina had improved a great deal compared to their previous sparring sessions. Irina admitted that she had been training with her father. Uriel called Lucia, and Lucia turned to see her mother, approaching, asking if she had looked cool out there. Uriel ruffled Lucia's hair and praised her, and Lucia smiled, basking in her mother's approval. Uriel told them that if they did not want another round, they should clean up and meet in the classroom to begin learning about miracles. Irina and Lucia's eyes lit up and they ran off together, chattering excitedly about the idea of summoning meteors. Uriel decided it would be best for Lucia to learn miracles alongside Irina to streamline their education. She explained that, since neither girl had experience, it made sense for them to learn together rather than allowing a gap between their studies. While Irina had trained with her father for the past months to catch up to Lucia, Lucia had been trained by Uriel to refine her control of holy power. Uriel took their backgrounds into account. Irina would be slightly behind because she had not grown up within the institution and would not be able to wield holy power fully until she became Lucia's apostle, but the shared lessons would provide solid foundational knowledge. Lucia asked if they could begin immediately, and Irina reminded her to be respectful in how she spoke to their mother. Uriel smiled and held up that they should not get too far ahead. She still needed to explain what they would be learning that day. Uriel emphasized that, until Irina became an apostle, Irina would not be able to practice actual miracles, so the lesson would focus on explanation and a basic exercise for Lucia. Lucia nodded eagerly, ready to absorb everything. Uriel wrote the word miracle on the chalkboard and asked if anyone wanted to define it. Lucia answered that miracles were the church's magic, a system that used floating letters to rewrite the world around them to create powerful effects like explosions or fire. Irina nodded along, starstruck. Uriel acknowledged Lucia's summary and offered a more detailed explanation. She described miracles as the church's primary magical system, the power of saints and prophets, and the powers belonging to God and angels. Uriel explained that with holy power, they could rewrite the world, turning ideas and metaphors into tangible effects. To demonstrate, incomprehensible letters in the angelic language swirled around her hand and formed a torrent of fire that sprang up. The letters shifted again, and a shining, whale-like creature of light swam above her palm, illustrating the miracle that recreated the great fish from the old scriptures. Uriel said that miracles could make stories from scripture manifest or rewrite surrounding reality. Lucia scribbled notes eagerly, and Irina fumbled with her hands, trying to manifest letters of her own. Uriel closed her hand and dispersed the demonstration, then explained that angels could use innate holy power to manifest miracles, but humans accessed holy power differently. Uriel described how humans could gain holy power by connecting to the Sephirot, comparing it to a great system at the top of heaven that granted power to prayers. Humans typically prayed for years to channel holy power, but as an apostle, Irina would have a different experience. Lucia reminded Irina that she would give her something called a sacred factor. Uriel confirmed that that night Irina would receive a sacred factor from Lucia to mark her status as an apostle. The sacred factor would allow Irina to use holy power as if it were her own and to borrow power from the system without the usual requirement of long prayer. Irina reacted with wide-eyed excitement and begged to receive it immediately. Uriel said the rite would take place later, after the lesson. Irina pouted briefly but nodded. Lucia placed a hand on Irina's shoulder and promised to teach everything their mother showed her. Uriel cautioned that there was only one thing to remember for now, and Lucia acknowledged it. Uriel then introduced the first, very simple miracle. She formed a small circle of letters above her hand and a swirling mist coalesced, explaining that the miracle allowed one to create clouds. Lucia thought the concept unimpressive at first, but Uriel pointed out it was a safe first lesson and useful for mastering fundamentals, especially since Lucia already had experience with her personal power, Lelial. Irina asked whether Lelial was the dark light she often saw Lucia use, and Uriel confirmed the association. Uriel then organized the board into 3 columns to explain different miracle categories and tapped the left column to begin, noting that the first category was known as power of prayer miracles that anyone could use, such as the pillar of clouds. Uriel explained that miracles could be things one read about in the Bible or ordinary phenomena like fire. Lucia and Irina nodded. Uriel continued by describing the second category, powers of God, special miracles tied to certain angels. She gave the example of Lucia's power of God, Lelial, which allowed Lucia to fuse light and dark. Uriel wrote the name Lahacherib on the board and said it was the strongest fire on the planet. Lucia giddily recalled that Auntie Sandy once told her that their mother had destroyed an entire army of demons with it in a single swing. Irina looked at Uriel with stars in her eyes. Uriel said she needed to talk to Sandalphon about the stories Sandalphon told the children. Uriel's expression turned serious as she introduced the last category, forbidden miracles. Uriel asked the girls to promise that they would not cast these except as a last resort. She fixed her gaze on her daughter, who stiffened and nodded. Uriel explained that forbidden miracles were monitored by heaven and were extremely dangerous. One wrong move could destroy everything and everyone nearby. Lucia and Irina became pale at the warning. The classroom door opened and Griselda reported that Sandalphon was waiting in Uriel's office. Uriel sighed. Lucia pleaded that their mother should not work and should show them some cool miracles, but Uriel asked Griselda to tell Sandalphon that she had something going on and to have Ferdinand and Tuji entertain Sandalphon while she finished teaching the children. Griselda replied that Sandalphon had said it was important and mentioned a transfer. Irritated at the interruption, Uriel asked Griselda to take over the lesson and show Lucia how to cast the Pillar of Clouds miracle, promising to return after she finished with Sandalphon. Before leaving, Uriel reassured Lucia that they would continue after Auntie Sandy's visit. Zelda would show her the Pillar of Clouds and then they could work more on Lelial. Lucia asked for a promise and Uriel promised. Lucia smiled as Uriel left the room. Griselda began the lesson. Lucia asked if their mother really intended to teach them how to use clouds. Irina remembered the time Lucia had summoned water and ice to blast a mountain and expected more dramatic demonstrations. Griselda explained that for now they would learn the cloud miracle because it was useful in combat. She reminded them of the vampire that had once chased Lucia and Irina, and asked if Lucia had been able to see him through the fog. Lucia admitted she had not. Griselda urged them to imagine using fog to hide their attacks. Lucia's eyes lit up as she pictured using fog to mask her moves while Irina struck from the side. Irina agreed enthusiastically. Lucia closed her eyes and focused on drawing out her holy power, which she had learned to control more finely over the past months. A faint red glow appeared between her hands as symbols began to spin. Griselda explained that Lucia should use her holy power to form fog and that the symbols acted as guides, like writing on paper. The angelic script that appeared around them helped shape their changes to the world. Lucia nodded and concentration made the letters flicker and vanish. A thick cloud formed between her hands and grew rapidly. Lucia excitedly called for Griselda to look, but Griselda told her to stop as the cloud kept expanding. Lucia found she could not stop it. The cloud swelled until it engulfed the entire classroom. In her office, Uriel suppressed a sigh as she heard the distant shouts about clouds and smiled wryly at her older sister. Sandalphon teased that Uriel had taken Helen's advice about finally giving Lucia some training. Uriel noted the timing was inconvenient but invited Sandalphon to sit. Sandalphon hesitated only when someone tugged her dress. She turned and guided a small, frightened girl out from behind her to a chair. Sandalphon stroked the girl's hair and reassured her that she would be safe and that this place would be her new home. The child's trembling eased at the touch. Uriel asked who the girl was. Sandalphon explained that the abbey where the child had lived had been closed due to several unfortunate circumstances involving its priest. The child had been considered a saint by the town. Her sacred gear had awakened when she had, in a moment of compassion, tried to heal a puppy, according to local accounts. Uriel observed that Sandalphon had perhaps softened the story with a bit of fluff. Uriel turned her gaze to the girl and asked whether the sacred gear was what she suspected. Sandalphon confirmed that it was the twilight healing and explained that this was why the girl had been labeled a saint. Sandalphon then introduced the child as Asia Argento and asked Uriel to take her in. He said he had considered placing Asia in an orphanage at the Vatican but worried that would be a political hot zone, and he thought it better to have someone with experience raising children look after her. Uriel ran a hand through her hair and sighed at the reasoning, while Sandalphon countered that it would also be good for Lucia to have more friends. Uriel considered the point, then asked Asia if she would like to stay. Asia fidgeted with her skirt and stammered that she hoped it was really okay for her to live there. Uriel nodded and told her it was fine, mentioning that she had a daughter about Asia's age who would likely be happy to make a new friend. Sandalphon warned not to be put off by Lucia's stoic expression and said that Lucia could be warm once she opened up. Uriel bristled and defended her daughter fiercely, insisting that Lucia was a pure and wonderful child and recounting an instance when Irina had coaxed 3 words out of her at the park. Asia watched Uriel's sudden tirade without fear for the first time since her church closed, and a warm feeling made her smile. When Uriel returned to the classroom a few hours later with Asia, Irina and Lucia blinked in surprise. Tuji followed and closed the door behind them. Uriel announced that Asia would be living with them starting that day and explained that Asia's home had been shut down, so Sandalphon had brought her to live with them. Lucia tilted her head and regarded the girl with a stoic look while Irina nudged Lucia and urged her to greet Asia. Lucia rubbed the back of her head and introduced herself. Asia answered shyly. Lucia then asked Uriel if they could perform the apostle ceremony now, which made Uriel exchange a weary look and then prepare the girls. Irina detached from Lucia and took Asia's hands, introducing herself as Lucia's friend and expressing hope that they could be friends too. Asia's eyes widened and she nodded eagerly. Lucia approached more slowly, and her internal warning system scanned Asia to estimate capabilities. The warning system reported attributes that suggested an average combat level around 70, with a strength of 4, speed 6, durability 5, magic 45, and skill 10. It identified Asia as a 7-year-old human female, noted her status as a saint and a dragon tamer, and recorded her equipment as Twilight Healing. Lucia felt a strong sense of déjà vu and suddenly declared that Asia matched a vision she had had. Asia was the holy maiden who would marry the Red Dragon Emperor. Asia flinched and moved behind Uriel. Uriel chastised Lucia for scaring her and instructed her to apologize. Lucia lowered her head and said sorry, and Asia accepted the apology. Uriel then told the girls they would begin the ritual and directed Asia to stand by Tuji and Griselda. Lucia and Irina brightened at the announcement. Asia approached Tuji and Griselda and stood closer to Griselda, looking apprehensive. Uriel arranged Lucia and Irina into specific positions for the ceremony. Griselda questioned whether such precise positioning was necessary, recalling that Gabriel had not required it for her own appointment, and Uriel explained that this arrangement would stabilize Lucia because the procedure would significantly drain her power. Lucia confirmed her position and stood over a sigil inscribed with several Enochian characters. Irina asked nervously whether it would hurt, and Uriel reassured her that it would only sting a little. Uriel instructed Lucia to separate a portion of her holy power from her body, a process different from the usual summoning and projection of energy, and to focus on drawing out a substantial amount. Lucia closed her eyes and concentrated. A black and red aura of holy energy gathered around her, a wind stirred in the room, and the lights flickered. The aura flowed from her body into her hands and condensed into a swirling mass of mist between her palms. Her body suddenly felt heavy. A warning flashed in her vision reporting that 65% of her holy power had been removed, then vanished. Uriel instructed Lucia to condense the remaining energy, telling her to imagine making a snowball and to roll the swirling holy power until it became a crystal. Lucia nodded tiredly and focused on the mass before her. She moved her hands, shaping and compressing the mist until it solidified into a small pentagonal block the size of a chocolate bar. The swirling vapor had almost completely condensed into a glowing black and red clump of holy power. Uriel placed a hand on Lucia's shoulders and told her to maintain it and to push inward to finish. A bead of sweat traced down Lucia's forehead as she gritted her teeth and pressed her palms together. With effort, the clump shrank until it was the size of a ring, emitting a soft red glow. Lucia collapsed forward. Before she or the ring could hit the floor, Uriel caught both. Lucia asked if she had done it, and Uriel confirmed that she had. Uriel held up the ring-sized crystalline mass and identified it as the sacred factor, explaining that it would allow Irina to use holy power and draw more from the Sephirot without suffering severe backlash. Lucia gave Irina a weak thumbs up in encouragement, and Irina returned the gesture with a smile. Uriel warned that the next step would sting and explained that Lucia would have to implant the sacred factor directly into Irina. Lucia pushed herself up using her mother for support. The sacred factor levitated from Uriel's hand and Lucia directed it telekinetically toward Irina. It hovered just before Irina's chest, and she stared at it with a mixture of awe and nervousness. Uriel reminded them that Lucia's permission was required. Apostlehood demanded the agreement of both parties for someone to become a chosen vessel. Irina took a deep breath and recited the acceptance prayer, stumbling over a few unfamiliar words as she affirmed her willingness to receive divine grace in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and concluded with Amen. The crystal glowed brighter, then slipped from Lucia's grasp and flowed into Irina's chest as if it were water. Power surged through Irina immediately. Red luminous lines spread across her neck and body like veins of light, and her eyes shone red for a moment. She gave a small whimper as a brief burning sensation rippled beneath her skin. A burst of red light filled the room, prompting everyone to shield their eyes. When they looked again, a single pair of red ethereal wings had unfurled from Irina's back before fading away. Irina staggered forward and nearly lost her balance, then stared at her hands and clenched them into fists. Stars lit up in her eyes as she looked at Lucia, clearly exhilarated by the transformation. She excitedly tried to manifest an aura of black and gold around herself, but it faded quickly. Lucia managed a small, shaky smile and noted that with this, they could finally fight the shadow monsters properly. Irina tried once more to summon the aura but failed, and Uriel reassured her that Griselda would take over the remainder of her training to help her learn control. It was natural that she still needed practice. Uriel then insisted that they go to bed. Irina protested, but Uriel stood firm, reminding them that Lucia was exhausted from the ritual and needed rest. Lucia felt like lead in her limbs and, after a moment of resistance, conceded. Uriel told Lucia she could train in the morning and asked her to show Asia to her room. Lucia paused at the doorway and looked back at the shy blonde girl standing beside Griselda. After a moment's hesitation, Lucia reached out and took Asia's hand, saying that she would show Asia her and Irina's room. Asia's eyes widened, and Griselda offered a reassuring smile and a gentle nudge. Lucia led Asia out of the room, and Uriel smiled as the three girls departed. Tuji then asked Uriel why she had accepted Lady Sandalphon's request. Uriel shook her head and explained that there was no single reason. Twilight healing was appealing, but her primary motive was to give Lucia a chance at a normal childhood, to let her grow up among other children and make friends. Tuji suggested that Rika and he had been looking into local schools and planned to enroll Irina in a few days, and he proposed bringing Lucia and Asia along to be enrolled as well. Uriel agreed, noting she had already been considering school for Lucia so the girl could interact with peers. Tuji offered to provide the school's name, and Uriel replied that she would handle it after contacting Lucia's aunt. That night, Lucia tossed and turned in bed, clutching her cat plushie and murmuring in her sleep. In her dream, a figure clad in white armor streaked across the sky, engaging in stylized, high-energy battles against foes ranging from a 10-winged fallen angel to a formidable devil and several dragons. The white-armored figure fought alongside another clad in red, racing through each confrontation with dynamic, anime-like intensity. The white-armored figure urged a rival to understand that strength was everything and demanded that the rival become stronger, promising that one day they would face each other in combat. The rivalry between them burned bright in the dream, and the armored figure ended with a quiet lament about the harshness of the present age and a regret at being born into such times. A world without God. She had once wanted to try to defeat God. Despite all the fights and challenges, beyond everything, Lucia's eyes widened as she witnessed the turmoil in his heart. She stood in the room and watched him cry and beg. His father's eyes brimmed with malice as he loomed over the boy's mother, who had collapsed while the boy had tried to protect her. The white-haired man shouted that the boy was worthless and that such an existence should never have been born, and then moved as if to strike. Lucia acted on instinct and dashed forward to protect the boy, but she tripped and fell. Lucia groaned as she hit her head, rubbed it, and realized it had all been a dream. The faint moonlight still drifted through her curtains. Irina and Asia remained fast asleep. Yawning, Lucia walked over to her notebook and opened it. She flipped through several pages of sketches of people she had seen in her dreams and stopped at a blank sheet. Taking a white crayon, she sketched for a few minutes. After she was done, Lucia rubbed her eyes drowsily and returned to bed. On the open notebook was a childlike drawing of an armored man with blue wings. Beneath the drawing were two words, White Dragon. A resonant boom echoed as water in the creek splashed violently, sending mist everywhere. Lucia jumped up and down in excitement while preparing another blast and called out to Rin and Asia to make sure they had seen it. Irina protested that it was not fair and insisted it should be her turn. Lucia paused, then smiled and stepped aside, according to the manners her mother had taught her. Lucia reminded Irina to remember what Mama and Zelda had said. Irina concentrated, holding her hands close together and closing her eyes. Not long after Irina became an apostle, Lucia had noticed a change in the color of her holy aura and had asked Uriel, who had explained that the color depended on the user. A triangular gold halo appeared above Irina's head as swirls of gold light and deep shadow gathered between her palms. Her eyebrow furrowed as she struggled to keep the orb together. Lucia urged Irina to throw the orb before Lilial could. Asia did her best to mimic Lucia's enthusiasm. Irina strained and released the compressed ball of holy energy, but in her panic she overestimated the force. The swirling orb sped across the creek and struck a tree on the opposite shore. A bright flash and a shockwave of wind swept through the area, and when the dust cleared, a portion of the tree appeared to have vanished, leaving a wide crater that immediately began to fill with water from the creek. Irina stood with her mouth open, stunned at the sight. Lucia stared at the crater, speechless. When Irina turned, she saw someone standing behind Lucia and exclaimed that it had been impressive. Lucia froze and then slowly turned to face her mother. Uriel stood with arms crossed, her expression stern. She spoke Lucia's full name in a way that made Lucia realize she was in trouble. Uriel's green eyes narrowed as she reminded Lucia that they had agreed not to practice in the woods and asked where Lucia had learned the inappropriate word she had used. Lucia's eyes darted around as she stammered that Friar Christoph had said it when he had touched a cup by accident and had told her it made sentences sound cooler. Uriel listened hard for a few tense seconds, then sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose, warning Lucia not to use the word again and telling her they needed to talk. Lucia noticed that her mother was dressed differently. Her hair was tied back and she wore more formal, grown-up attire. Lucia chased after her and called to her as Uriel glanced over her shoulder and instructed Irina and Asia to come along as well. When the three girls entered the room, Irina's father Tuji and another woman Lucia had seen a few times were waiting. The woman had long dark hair and violet eyes and wore a lavender blouse with a red coat and black skirt. Lucia greeted Auntie Rika and Uncle Tuji, and Rika pushed her glasses up and returned the greeting. Irina addressed her mother politely. Uriel gestured for the girls to take a seat, and they sat across from the adults. Uriel explained that, after consulting with Auntie Sandy, she had decided that Lucia and Irina would attend the local school, with Asia starting a few months later. Lucia immediately objected that she did not want to go to school. Uriel tried to reassure her that school could be fun, a place to meet friends, learn new things, and play with other kids. Lucia pointed out that Uriel did not go to school anymore. Uriel reminded her that she was a grown-up and no longer needed to attend. Rika interjected, suggesting that Irina should attend school and asked whether Lucia would want to be with her apostle, noting that an angel and her apostle should stay together and learn to work as a team. Rika explained that fighting the shadows required more than powers. It required learning many other things as well. Lucia's thoughts jumped to the possibility of shadows targeting Irina at school, and she stiffened at the thought. Rika smiled and encouraged Lucia, saying it was a good opportunity for an angel and her apostle to build teamwork and learn together. When Lucia asked why Asia could not come immediately, Uriel explained that Asia still had to finish learning German. Lucia pouted and tugged at the hem of her shorts. Tuji suggested that school might help Lucia find teammates and meet interesting people. Lucia thought about the idea, imagining the way heroes in Irina's favorite shows began their journeys at school. The thought of learning to fight the shadows with a team made a broad smile spread across her face, and she agreed to go. Irina, who remembered the less enjoyable parts of school, tried to share in Lucia's enthusiasm for her friend's sake. Uriel clapped her hands together and announced that Lucia and Irina would start in 2 days and that she had already prepared Lucia's backpack and lunchbox. Later, Uriel found herself regretting not enrolling Lucia sooner. If she had known how adorable Lucia would look in the outfit she had prepared, she would have done it earlier. Quietly, she took a picture of her daughter with her phone. Lucia wore a small white sweater under an unzipped red jacket, a red pleated skirt, long white stockings, and red and white sneakers. A feather from Uriel hung from her backpack as a charm and a way to locate her if needed. Lucia stood beside her mother, staring up at the sign that read Wing Primary School. The town was a small mountain town in the regional district, so finding a primary school was not difficult. According to many parents, Wing Primary School had a good reputation for providing a solid education, which was what Uriel wanted. Although they lived far from the district center, many students who finished at Wing went on to reputable secondary schools elsewhere. Uriel could teach Lucia many things, from math to languages, but she could not replace the experience of attending school. Lucia asked her mother if she really had to come. She had never been around so many people before. She glanced at Irina, who seemed untroubled, and said goodbye to her parents. She needed to be brave. How could she fight the shadows if she was afraid of school? Lucia gripped her backpack straps tightly and told her mother that she was off. Uriel restrained the urge to gush at her daughter's cuteness and called after her that she would pick her up after school. Lucia then fell in line with Irina. Lucia did not know what to expect from school. She had only heard Irina's stories about spending the day in a classroom with a teacher, and Lucia had always had only one teacher in her life, her mother. As they waited outside the classroom, Lucia heard the teacher announce that 2 new students were joining and that one of them had traveled all the way from Japan. Lucia's gaze darted to Irina with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Irina urged her to go inside, reminding her that the teacher had asked them to enter. Lucia nodded and followed, feeling both nervous and oddly suspicious. What if school was a front for the shadows? Before she could seize Irina's hand and run, Irina opened the door and walked in. The teacher, a kindly woman in her late 20s, told the new girls to introduce themselves. Lucia scanned the classroom while Irina introduced herself. Lucia's eyes flicked across her future classmates, searching for anyone of use. She noticed a girl at the back with long white hair and hazel eyes, skinny and short, wearing an oversized black jacket and green shorts. When Irina nudged her, Lucia returned to the moment and stammered her own introduction, giving her name and age. Irina mouthed a fragment in support. Lucia then blurted that she liked swords and magic and that her dream was to become a hero like her mother. Her face flushed as the room fell quiet. The teacher clapped and encouraged the others to applaud. Lucia, normally stoic, felt shame and gripped the hem of her jacket as her classmates clapped. The teacher asked what Lucia's mother did. Lucia remembered that she was supposed to say that her mother ran an orphanage and had served in the army. Lucia said that her mother owned an orphanage and had been in the army. The class grew curious, but the teacher quieted them and said questions could wait until recess. The teacher then directed Lucia and Irina to sit near the back, indicating that a chair by Hans and Lena was open. Irina and Lucia went to their desks. While Irina greeted neighbors, Lucia kept glancing at the white-haired girl looking out the window. When Lucia attempted to scan the girl, her vision returned only an error. The scan failed because the target was being actively protected by a secondary presence. She tried again but could not generate target data. Frustrated, Lucia set aside the scan and refocused on the lesson. Her mother had already taught her the order of operations. She watched the teacher and kept one eye on the girl at the window, accepting that even her mother could not hide everything from her. Recess finally arrived. Lucia felt bored but did her best to pay attention. Father Ferdinand had taught her to listen when her mother was unavailable. Irina, naturally bubbly, tugged Lucia to the playground with the other children, and a group quickly gathered around them. As the other kids surrounded Irina, Lucia stood quietly beside her, listening and nodding. When some girls pulled Irina away, Lucia found herself facing a small group alone. One of the boys asked Lucia if her mother had been in the army. There was a chubby kid with blonde hair who looked about a year younger than Lucia. She nodded in response. The boy proudly announced that his daddy was a cop and a hero. Other children chimed in that their parents were police officers or firefighters. One child claimed her mother was a secret agent, which made Lucia raise an eyebrow. In her childish mind, however, none of their parents could compare to her mother. To Lucia, her mother was an archangel. Uriel would always be the coolest thing to ever exist. The boy went on to boast that his father once rescued people from a bank robbery. Lucia tilted her head as he described a scene where his father confronted dozens of robbers and fired his weapon to protect the people inside. He added that his father had been awarded a medal. The other kids nodded and added their own stories of parents who stopped fires or rescued people. Lucia listened politely and admitted that those things were cool, but she believed her mother was a greater hero. She said that her mother had once fought a dragon in a place called Canaan a long time ago. The room fell quiet and the other children looked at her strangely. Lucia recounted the story her mother had told her about a dragon with 7 heads as large as a country. Her mother had not faced it alone. She had fought it alongside aunts, uncles, her grandfather, and an entire army. Lucia described how her mother and the others had planned to trap the dragon under the sea. As she spoke, the other kids gradually drifted away to play other games, and one by one they left. Lucia's shoulders sagged slightly as she watched them go. She walked to the wall, leaned back, and slid down until she was sitting on the ground with her knees hugged to her chest. She watched the playground while sighing, until she noticed she was not alone. A girl from class with messy white hair sat beside her, holding a book. Lucia squinted at the cover and tried to make out the title, Paradise Lost. Lucia greeted her, and the girl startled, nearly dropping the book. The girl's hazel eyes widened through her bangs, and she introduced herself as Val. A few moments of awkward silence passed. Lucia told Val her name, and Val gripped the book and admitted shyly that her mother had given it to her for her birthday. The two sat together, the distant screams and laughter of their classmates forming a soft background. Lucia mentioned that her mother had given her a practice sword for her birthday and promised to get her a real one like Zelda's when she was older. Zelda, Lucia explained, was like a super cool big sister who used both a laser gun and a sword that resembled a lightsaber. Val listened with a hint of skepticism. Lucia glanced around to make sure no one was watching and, feeling safe with Val, she manifested a swirl of red light in the palm of her hand. She noted that her mother's light was blue but that hers would probably be red. Val reached out to touch it and pulled back at a sting, asking if red meant something bad. Lucia reassured her that red was used by the good side. Her mother used red too. She dispersed the light and Val laughed, a sound Lucia had not expected. Lucia stared at Val, and the girl blushed and scratched the back of her head, apologizing quietly. Lucia reached out and placed a hand on Val's head, explaining that her mother patted her head whenever she felt down. Val froze for a moment, then nodded and said she felt better. Admitted that her mother patted her head too, but that her father was frightening. Val explained that her father did not like it when her mother did things for her and that he became scary whenever her mother was not around. Lucia glanced at her new friend and, thinking about how wrong that felt, remarked that Val's father sounded like a bad person. Val protested that her father was still her father and that he had once been nice. The bell rang, signaling the children to return to class. Val stood up and dusted off her shorts, preparing to head back in. Val picked up her book, waved to Lucia, and indicated goodbye. The first day of school passed without further interaction with Val. Lucia kept glancing at the quiet girl and attempted to scan her with the warning system, but the system always returned that the target was being actively protected by a secondary presence and prompted whether to scan that presence. Lucia huffed and scribbled in her notebook, breezing through the practice math questions the teacher had given. When she finished the last question, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first day of class. She sighed and thought about going home to practice miracles with her mother. Lucia asked Irina whether school was going to be like this every day. Irina packed her notebook into her backpack and explained that her parents insisted she attend school and then college so she could get a good job. Lucia grabbed her backpack, which had angel wings attached, and insisted that they were going to be heroes and fight the epilogue together. She invited Irina to go to the creek with her, but then both girls noticed several kids surrounding Irina and offering invitations for playdates. Some of the children even offered to visit her at the institution. Irina told them she had to go because she and Lucia lived in the same place and promised to see them later. The other kids groaned in disappointment but agreed to meet at the park another time. Lucia and Irina left with the other children and waited outside for their parents. Lucia said she had made a new friend during recess and pointed out Val standing alone, reading a book and avoiding the other group. Lucia introduced Val to Irina as someone she had met at recess and described her as a cool girl. Irina began to respond with surprise, but before she could finish, a man called Val's name as he approached. He had white hair, a polite smile, and wore a button-up shirt. His smile unsettled Lucia, though she tried to hold her ground. Irina, more sensitive because of her sacred factor, felt something off about him and unconsciously gripped her backpack straps tightly. The man asked whether these were Val's friends. Val answered that they were, addressing him as Dad while keeping her gaze down and trembling slightly. The man placed a hand on Val's shoulder and called her a little rascal, saying she was always getting into trouble. Val flinched at his touch. The man urged Val to come home and Val fell. Into step behind him, glancing back and offering a weak smile to Irina and Lucia as she left. Lucia noticed a bruise peeking from the collar of Val's sweater and moved as if to follow, but Irina gripped her arm to stop her and shook her head. Lucia asked Irina what was wrong. Irina pointed at the man and, with a trembling voice, identified him as a D-devil. Far away in Lucia's dream, windswept dunes rose above a roiling sea under a thunderous sky. Rain lashed down as a seaside town stood battered after a catastrophic encounter. The streets were scarred by the clash, buildings were damaged, and the scene bore the quiet weight of loss and ruin. A single hooded figure knelt before a tear in the sky. The rip in the air spread like cracked glass, opening onto a shimmering void that scattered lights like a night sky. From that breach, a shadow stared outward with hollow red eyes, then poured through as a dark, shifting substance that coalesced into a humanoid silhouette. It raised a hand and dark tendrils swept across land and sea in a sweeping, overwhelming motion, reaching like vines to ensnare the world. The shadow turned its gaze toward the dreamer and addressed Sophia, taunting whether she felt like a hero. Lucia woke with a start, cold sweat on her skin and her heart racing. She gripped her sheets and forced herself to take slow, deep breaths, using the calming technique her mother had taught her. She breathed the word shadow and held the memory of the dream in her mind. Her mother, Uriel, called to her urgently, and Lucia's head snapped up. Uriel noticed the haunted expression Lucia wore, an expression Uriel had seen in children affected by war, and softened her gaze. Uriel approached and placed a hand on Lucia's shoulder, asking if everything was okay. Lucia asked whether dreams ever came true and admitted she had had a bad dream about a shadow. She tried to describe it, saying it had looked like a terrifying shadow person in a beachside town with a hooded figure present, and that the shadow had made a bunch of plants before looking at her and saying something about someone named Sophia. Uriel felt a chill of foreboding at that last name and paused, unsettled by the possibility that Lucia's dreams were reaching beyond the ordinary. Lucia insisted that Auntie Ellie had said it was by a beach. Uriel looked at her daughter for a few seconds, sighed, and explained that dreams do come true, but only good dreams. If a dream came true, it meant the dreamer was either a good person or a special person called a prophet. Lucia asked if that made her a prophet. Uriel hesitated, told her that only Auntie Ellie would know for sure, and promised to ask her about prophets later. Uriel then steered the conversation back to the present task, reminding Lucia that they needed to finish the survival exercise and that when she grew up she would go on many adventures. Lucia nodded eagerly and followed her mother. That day in class, Lucia kept stealing glances at Val and scribbling in her notebook, sketching plans for how to get to Val's house. After Irina had mentioned that Val's father was a devil, Lucia had been determined to find a way to help. It had only been a few days since they had enrolled in school, and after the first day Val had withdrawn from Lucia, refusing to speak for the first 2 days. With Irina's help and Lucia's persistence, they had begun to speak again. Lucia drifted as the teacher lectured on multiplication. Miss Wiederhold called on her to answer a question about the times tables. Lucia answered that 5 times 5 equaled. Miss Wiederhold acknowledged the correct answer but scolded Lucia for doodling instead of paying attention. Lucia flushed as the class stared. Val watched her with concern and quietly asked how she had known the answer. Lucia credited her mother as the smartest person in the world, and Val replied that her own mother was smart too and made very good noodles. Lucia winced inwardly at the memory of her mother's disastrous omelet attempt, which the exorcists in the compound had joked could have been a catastrophe, and then laughed nervously that her mother was good at cooking as well. Miss Wiederhold told them both to pay attention, and they returned to the lesson. School ended without incident. Lucia wondered how many more years of lessons her mother would insist on, but she had to admit that spending time with Val at school was enjoyable. She hurried outside and found Val standing with a woman Lucia had never seen before. This woman was nearly as tall as Aunt Rika, with kind green eyes that also carried a skittishness and deep fatigue. Despite the warm weather, she wore long sleeves and a high collar. Val greeted her mother and walked over. Irina trailed close behind Lucia. The woman asked how school had been, and Val said it had been fine. Lucia noticed how differently Val lit up when speaking to her mother compared with how she had acted with others. Val's mother noticed the girls standing behind her and adjusted her glasses. Val introduced her friends, naming Irina as Rin and presenting Lucia. Lucia blinked as Val's mother smiled in a way that reminded her of her own mother. The woman introduced herself as Eleonora Zora and said it was very nice to meet Lucia. Lucia blushed and stammered her name, and Irina bowed politely. Eleonora praised their politeness and thanked them for being friends with Val, adding that Val needed more friends. She told Val they should go home because Val's father would be back in a few hours and she still had to make dinner for him, knowing how he could be when hungry. Val nodded, gripped her backpack, and waved nervously to Lucia and Irina. Lucia suddenly asked if they could come over to play. She grabbed Val's hands. Val turned red at the contact and hesitated. Lucia explained that she would ask her mother to arrange it and even suggested bringing others along. Irina hesitated because of what she had sensed about Val's father but did not want to leave Lucia alone facing the situation, and she agreed to come. Both girls told Eleonora that they wanted to come over and play with Val. Her happy and expectant face was not something Eleonora had expected, and she felt the stares of the other parents on her. She sighed and, reluctantly, agreed to let the children visit while asking about Lucia's mother. Lucia ran off to fetch her mother, promising that her mother would say yes. Eleonora thought to herself that she had to keep the girls away from the house. If her husband found out their child had guests, she could only imagine the consequences for her son. She looked down at her son, the apple of her eye, who gripped his bag nervously. Lucia called out to her mother, announcing that this was her friend. Eleonora looked up as Lucia returned, dragging her mother by the hand. Uriel told Lucia to slow down. Lucia stopped in front of Eleonora and Val and introduced the two children and their mothers, identifying Eleonora as Miss Zora. Uriel glanced at Eleonora and then at the young child beside her. Eleonora noticed the snow-white hair, hazel eyes, and an unusual presence that felt like both dragon and devil. She kept her face impassive as she considered the child. Uriel apologized for her daughter's forwardness and introduced herself as Uriel Reed, Lucia's mother. Eleonora nodded and admitted she was just glad Val had made a friend. She had been worried because her child had not talked much about school until recently, and now came home excitedly mentioning this friend. Uriel replied that Lucia had also been talking about a new friend and that she had not expected to meet the child in person. As Uriel glanced across at the children chatting, Eleonora noticed a hint of darker skin at the collar of Uriel's sweater and filed it away without comment. Eleonora told Uriel that her daughter had been asking to come over and that she did not mind, but she did not want to impose. Lucia pleaded with her mother, and Uriel observed her daughter's unusually sincere begging. Uriel considered Val for a moment before giving an answer. She agreed to let them stay only until 5 in the afternoon and insisted that Zelda accompany Lucia and Irina to the house. Lucia accepted the condition enthusiastically. She welcomed the idea of having Griselda there as support. Lucia asked if Asia could come as well, and when Uriel hesitated because Asia had lessons, Lucia continued to beg, even offering to do chores as a bargaining point. Noting the judgmental glances of other parents, Uriel relented on the condition that Lucia do all her own chores and half of Asia and Irina's chores. Lucia stiffened at the request but agreed. Uriel instructed that Zelda would come with Asia and asked Lucia to be good for Val's mother. Lucia promised to behave and took Irina's hand. Before they departed, Uriel pulled Lucia close and hugged her, cautioning her to be careful and reminding her that Zelda would help if anything happened. Lucia understood and ran back to join Val and Irina. Val's house was much closer to the school than Lucia had expected. Rather than some isolated dwelling, it was a modest 2-story house in a suburban neighborhood, with a slightly worn brown roof and an overgrown lawn. A few envelopes were tucked into the mailbox. Lucia followed Val and her mother up the walkway, with Irina trailing behind and viewing the house warily. Lucia sensed a protective presence around Val and noted the family name associated with Val's household. She recognized the surname Lucifer and remembered hearing that name from her mother. It carried a reputation. Lucia wondered what that might mean for Val, but Val's friendly manner reassured her. Lucia decided Val was a kind person and put her worries aside. Eleonora indicated that Val could take her friends to her room. Eleonora set Val's backpack down against one of the couches and told Lucia she would prepare dinner for Val's father when he returned. Lucia looked around the living room and noticed how bare it was, as if they had just moved in. There were no photos of Val or her parents anywhere. Empty bottles of Johnny Walker whiskey sat on a table. Lucia reached for one, but Eleonora took it away before she could touch it and explained that it was not for children, that adults sometimes drank to forget things but that it could also hurt the people who loved them. Eleonora's jaw tightened at the memory, then she closed her eyes and forced a brave smile. She suggested Lucia go play in Val's room and promised to call when snacks were ready. Lucia nodded and walked up the stairs. As she moved down the hallway toward Val's door, she noticed another door slightly ajar. She tried to ignore it and be a good girl like she had promised her mother, but curiosity won, and she peeked inside. The office that the door opened to was almost too plain. Lucia held the straps of her backpack tightly as she scanned the room, hoping to find something she could bring to her mother. On the desk, an empty picture frame sat beside a partially opened envelope stamped with an 8-pointed star and strange, unreadable inscriptions. A harsh voice outside the door interrupted her. The man swore and said he would deal with someone later. Lucia ducked behind a couch as the door opened. Val's father, Issei, entered, running a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. He muttered angrily as he moved to the desk, set down a bottle, and, in a sudden flare of temper, swept his papers to the floor. He cursed about losing the work he had done and about having to relocate because of pressure from the church. He told himself he needed to make his move that night, shivering as if remembering something that frightened him. A faint, pulsing magic circle appeared at his ear when he answered a summon call. He spoke into it with mounting anxiety, assuring the other person that he could be ready by tonight, that he could bring his child if necessary, and promising to get results. The voice on the other end rattled him, and when the call ended he exhaled in relief, smoothed his hair, and left the office. When the house was quiet again, Lucia slipped from behind the couch and moved silently out of the room, intending to take the letter another time. Later, Lucia sat on the floor of Val's room. Unlike the crowded, shared room she slept in with Irina and Asia, Val's room felt impersonal. Only a few photographs of Val with her mother and no sign of her father. There were no toys, only a couple of books. Asia occupied a chair to the right and Irina leaned against the wall. Both girls shifted uncertainly, unsure how to help. They had been there 2 hours. Asia had arrived 30 minutes after Val's father and had been dropped off by Griselda, who said she would be nearby while patrolling the grounds. Lucia wondered aloud what Val usually did at home. Val answered that she mostly read or followed whatever her father told her to do. If she did not obey, he sent her to a bad room for punishment, a place that left her shaken. Her mother tried to intervene, but Val did not want her mother to get hurt. Her father insisted the punishments were for Val's own good, to prepare her for something, but Val could not explain what that meant. Irina asked what Val might be getting ready for. Asia observed that Val's father sounded very strict. Lucia, trying to be reassuring, insisted that Val's father was mean and that Val had not done anything wrong. Irina added that she and Asia had to help with Val's chores. Val, clutching at her shorts, asked them to stop calling her father bad. She admitted that she loved him, she had longed for a father, and when he finally came home it meant a great deal to her. Her father had warned that if she was not obedient he and her mother might leave, and the thought of losing either of them terrified her. The confession came out hesitant and raw, and the 3 girls fell silent, each left to consider what that fear meant. Irina hesitated and mentioned that Val's father sounded troubling. Asia looked between Irina and Vale, biting her lip in nervousness. Vale asked them to stop talking about his father and said he just wanted to play with them. Lucia volunteered to fetch snacks from Zelda and stood, telling Irina she was in charge. Irina panicked and asked what to do. Lucia reassured them that she knew a game for when she returned and hoped Zelda had brought brownies as she left the room. Lucia's smile faltered when she noticed the office door slightly ajar. She decided to see what kind of trouble Val's father might be causing and moved quietly toward the doorway, pressing herself against the wall. Inside, Issei announced that they were leaving that night. Eleonora pleaded about Vale and his school, protesting that they could not simply pack up and move. Rezaven snapped back angrily, berating her for bringing a Nephilim child and an exorcist into his house. Eleonora argued that she had done it for Valley, insisting he needed friends and was not a tool to be used. Rezaven's tone dropped and he demanded to know what she had just said. Suddenly a sharp sound echoed and a cry of pain followed. Someone had been struck and fallen. Rezaven yelled that she should obey him and accused her of being incapable of thinking for herself, angrily insisting she remember that she was only there because of the boy. Eleonora begged him not to take Valley and pleaded for mercy. Rezaven answered with more spiteful profanity and insults. Lucia stepped around the corner, shouting for him to leave Eleonora alone. Rezaven froze mid-motion and then laughed, his expression shifting as if this might be a convenient turn of events. Lucia bristled. She took a step back and her wings unfurled. She declared that she was an angel. Rezaven mocked her and advanced, his fingers clenching with a palpable, malevolent energy. Lucia felt the hateful power crawling along her skin. Before he could strike, Eleonora leaped at Rezaven and wrapped her arms around his waist, trying to hold him back. Rezaven demanded that she let go and, with a brutal move, struck her, sending her crashing to the floor. Eleonora's vision swam as she tried to steady herself. She urged Lucia to run. Lucia, terrified but determined, focused and gathered holy power to her hands. Strange script glowed around her. Rezaven turned to see the energy and scoffed, trying to locate her as she summoned a thick, holy mist that filled the office. The mist obscured vision and the room became a haze. Rezaven growled for her to show herself, and then a concentrated bolt of dark, red-black energy struck him. He was thrown off his feet and slammed into the wall, doubling over as the clash of opposing forces coursed through him and made him cry out in pain. Lucia dashed through the mist and pulled Eleonora to her feet. Eleonora's features softened as she rose and, without hesitation, scooped Lucia into her arms. She ran from the fog-covered room toward Vala's door and flung it open. Vala looked up and saw the bruise forming on his mother's cheek. He stared in alarm and asked what was happening. Rezaven's roar echoed through the hallway, freezing the children with fear. Eleonora urged the kids to leave immediately. Asia asked what was happening. Eleonora said they would talk about it later and insisted they go now. Valley asked about his father, but Eleonora told him to listen and come along. Lucia explained to Irina that Val's father had hit Val's mother and that he wanted to kill them. Irina and the others turned as Rezaven appeared a few feet from the doorway, his gaze filled with fury. A grotesque mark marred his cheek, a disturbing corruption as if some dark force had scarred him, and a dark stain reached the floor beneath him. Rezaven threatened to kill them, his fingers twitching with crackling red energy. Lucia moved to stand in front of Irina. Irina trembled but tried to steady herself, thinking that this felt like an encounter with a vampire from before. Irina's mind registered that it was just like the vampire. Asia cowered behind Irina, trembling at the sight of Rezaven as she closed her eyes and gripped Irina's jacket. Irina warned Rezaven not to touch the children, but Rezaven only mocked her and threatened them as he stepped closer. Lucia clenched her fists, fear and adrenaline surging through her. Her eyes shifted color as she assessed Rezaven. In her head, Lucia's scan cataloged him: Rezaven Lucifer Combat Level 1190, Strength 250, Speed 205, Durability 225, Magic 400, Skills Age 675 years, Pure-blooded Devil, Male, married to Eleonora Zora Lucifer. Equipment: Demonic Brilliance of Evil Light. Identified as Enemy. Weaknesses: Light Power, Holy Objects. Lucia froze at the enormity of his power and swallowed hard. She forced herself to remember anything her mama had taught that might help. Without thinking, Lucia snatched a crucifix from Asia's hand and hurled it at Rezaven. The crucifix glanced off Rezaven's chest and did little, but Lucia acted on training and pulled holy water from her backpack, splashing it toward him. Rezaven recoiled in agony as the holy water sizzled against his dark form, and he staggered back, clutching his face. Eleonora seized the children and fled Val's room, sprinting for the stairs. As she ran, the house's strange magic distorted the space between her and the front door, making the threshold seem to stretch away. Breathless and exhausted, she had to stop and set her son and Asia down. Eleonora panted and wondered if the creature's magic would be their end. Irina stayed close and begged Lucia for a plan. Lucia was shaking, but she forced herself to think of her mother's lessons about using the environment. Her gaze landed on the kitchen sink. She grabbed Irina and Asia by the hands and ran toward it. Asia reacted with alarm at Lucia's urgency. Lucia climbed onto the counter and tested the faucet. The sink head detached and extended a few inches. She sprayed water onto a dirty plate and channeled a red light into the stream, remembering the lesson from Old Man Ferdinand about harming devils with holy water. Irina understood immediately and climbed onto the counter to help. Lucia explained that she would bless and fire the water while the others kept the supply flowing. Irina pulled Asia up beside them. Eleonora hurried over and demanded to know what the children were doing, Val close behind. Downstairs, Rizavin announced that he knew they were still inside. Lucia hurled a harsh insult at him, trying to buy time. Asia flinched at the sudden language, and Lucia quickly hushed her, worried about what her mother would think. Rizavin entered the kitchen, red energy coiling around his hands as he berated Eleonora and blamed her for their current danger. Eleonora tried to keep him away from the children, but Rizavin turned and taunted Lucia, threatening to rip her wings. Fear shot through Lucia, and she called to Irina and Asia. Irina and Asia began a silent prayer, Enochian script flickering around them as they concentrated. Rizavin sneered as if nothing seemed to affect him. Lucia focused, infused the water with holy power, and released it. The blessed stream burst forward like a forceful blast. Rizavin was slammed into the wall and cried out in surprise and pain as the holy water struck him and disrupted his defenses. Smoke and singed marks flared across his dark form. He forced up a barrier and began to advance, fury blazing in his eyes. His garments were torn and he appeared badly scorched from the assault, but he kept moving, snarling that he would kill them. Lucia shouted for Eleonora to run. Eleonora snapped out of shock, grabbed Val, and fled for the door. This time she reached it and ran outside. The holy water struck Rizavin again and pushed him back, and he strained against the onslaught, driving a shadowy energy into his palm to fight the stream. As Rizavin staggered toward the countertops where Irina, Asia, and Lucia stood, the three children panicked. Irina asked Lucia what to do, and Asia continued her desperate prayer. Before anything else could happen, a vase suddenly flew from nowhere and struck Rizavin on the side of the head. Rizavin stumbled, dispersing the black light. The water surged forth unabated and he was thrown once more against the wall. He turned his head slowly to see Eleonora standing with her arm outstretched. Rizavin cursed and howled. Lucia invoked Enochian script and performed the miracle on the water, doubling the effect Asia and Irina had already produced. The force threw the children back, away from the faucet as a literal cannon shot of holy water blasted from it. Rizavin's protest echoed through the house before the blast sent him crashing through the wall. He slammed through several of the neighbors' fences and finally struck a parked car on the other street. The car alarm wailed through the neighborhood. Lucia sat up rubbing the back of her head and asked if they had won. Irina winced as she rubbed her arm and said she thought so. Asia ran over and began healing Irina's arm with her sacred gear while pleading to go home. Lucia agreed and stood, then winced as she noticed one of her wings bent at an odd angle. She worried that her mother would be angry. Asia hurried over and placed her hands on Lucia's injured wing. A soft green light emanated from her touch and the pain eased as the wing returned to normal. Lucia smiled, grateful, and spread her left wing. Eleonora approached and asked if the children were all right. Lucia apologized for making the kitchen dirty. Eleonora laughed, then surprised them by pulling the three girls into a hug and saying she was glad they were safe and would take them home. They left the ruined house together. Lucia stepped onto the street and saw Valley waiting for them. Valley ran up to them, calling to Lucia and Eleonora in obvious relief and concern, and hurried to check that they were okay. Lucia beamed and declared she was fine and strong because her mother was an angel. Valley noticed a cut on her cheek and produced a small bandage, gently placing it over the wound. Lucia thanked him and stepped back, touched by the gesture. Lucia then questioned Valley's gender, insisting he looked like a girl. Vale flushed and insisted he had always been a boy. Irina scolded Lucia for not realizing it sooner. Lucia argued that long hair and a cute face meant he couldn't be a boy, citing Uncle Tuji as a counterexample only to be reminded that Uncle Tuji had muscles. Vale affirmed again that he was a boy. The group froze when Rizaven limped into view. Eleonora gasped at the sight of her former husband. He was badly damaged and disfigured, barely able to move, his body scorched and mangled from the earlier blast. He looked like a shattered husk of the man he had been. Rizaven snarled threats to kill them, singling out the angelic child, and gathered dark energy in his remaining hand. He fired the blast at Lucia, who could not react in time. Vale leapt forward, throwing himself into the line of fire and raising his hands to shield the others. Eleonora lunged for her son, but the energy engulfed him. An unknown voice announced divide, and the blast was suddenly cut in half. The voice announced divide again, and the remaining blast evaporated into wisps of light that were drawn into a pair of wings sprouting from Vale's back. The wings were mechanical in appearance, white at the arms with membranes of blue light, resembling dragon wings. Lucia's warning system processed the change and identified Vale's ability as divine dividing, class Longinus. Rizaven seethed at the revelation that it was a Longinus. Vale examined his hands and the new wings in surprise, then turned toward Rizaven with a fierce glare and accused him of trying to hurt his friends. Rizaven flinched and took a step back, railing that he owned Vale and had made him what he was as dark energy crackled around his hand in preparation for another attack. A pulse of holy energy filled the area as Griselda appeared a short distance behind Rizaven. She explained that she had only gone to buy the children more snacks and that a lot had happened while she was gone. Lucia recognized Griselda's voice and called her name in relief. Rizaven panicked at the sight of another opponent and took to the sky as two pairs of wings unfurled from his back. He lashed out in anger and fear, gathering a massive crackling sphere of energy. Griselda assessed his condition and, noting his status, identified him as a devil. 3 pairs of ethereal blue wings manifested on Griselda's back along with a triangular halo, and her form briefly flickered out of sight. Before Rizaven could react, Griselda reappeared behind him and drove her heel into his back, sending him crashing back to the ground. He struck the ground with a tremendous force that shook the street and set off all the car alarms. Rizaven rasped that he would not die there and declared himself a descendant of Lucifer. Griselda stared at him coldly and raised her hand into the air. She invoked God and the angels and called for the power to deliver justice upon the demon. Her hands glowed blue as a swirl of ethereal water formed around her, condensing into incredibly dense orbs. Griselda explained that she channeled the power of God belonging to her Lady Gabriel, called Mabul Mayim, the same force as the Great Flood, and she closed her fist as the waters tightened into hyperdense masses. Rizaven snarled in disbelief and called Gabriel's name as the dense water projectiles fired at him with impossible speed. The torrent struck Rizaven, binding and engulfing him in a spinning sphere of water. Eleonora grabbed Vale and turned him away from the sight. Inside the globe, Rizaven convulsed as the water constricted. The sphere suddenly condensed and burst into a spray of shimmering droplets and light, and his presence dissolved, leaving no trace behind. Griselda landed on the pavement, brushing water from her coat as she stumbled forward. She turned and smiled faintly while Asia, Irina, and Lucia clung to her legs and waist. Griselda soothed them and wrapped her arms around the 3 girls, calling them her little goblins. Later, Lucia began to protest against her mother, but Uriel cut her off and informed her that there would be no arguments. Lucia was grounded and would take on Irina and Asia's cleaning duties for her room. Uriel silenced any bargaining firmly. She then took Lucia into a tight embrace and whispered that Lucia should never scare her like that again, tightening the hug. Lucia buried her face in her mother's arms and asked if that meant she was no longer grounded. Uriel replied that she would be grounded for 3 weeks, then relented to 2.5 weeks after Lucia's groan. Uriel told Lucia to go and check on her friends, and Lucia nodded before hurrying out of the office, passing a surprised Eleonora who was entering. Uriel gestured for Eleonora to sit in the chair in front of the desk. Eleonora fidgeted with her sweater sleeves and let her gaze linger on a photograph of Uriel with 6 others. The white-haired woman in the photo resembled her husband and Valley, and the infant in Uriel's arms appeared to be Lucia. Eleonora apologized for her daughter's behavior and admitted that, had it not been for her, her husband or ex-husband might have killed her. Uriel offered coffee, and Eleonora politely refused. Uriel explained that as an archangel she could not ignore the presence of a pure-blooded devil living in her town, especially one who had sired a son possessing a Longinus. Actions were necessary to protect the city's people. Eleonora widened her eyes and bowed her head, begging Uriel not to harm her child and offering her own life in exchange. Uriel told Eleonora to raise her head and reassured her that she would not kill her or her son. Uriel noted that Lucia seemed fond of Eleonora's son and that she did not wish to separate friends or to punish a mother and child who had done nothing wrong. Instead, Uriel offered Eleonora a job, promising reasonable hours, fair pay, and even 4 weeks of paid vacation if that was what she wanted. Eleonora hesitated and asked why Uriel would make such an offer. Uriel answered that it was repayment. Her daughter was friends with Eleonora's son, and Eleonora had tried to save her child. Eleonora listened quietly as the weight of those words sank in. Uriel then reached into a rippling space and produced an envelope stamped with an 8-pointed star. She placed the envelope in front of Eleonora and asked her to tell everything she knew about the Church of Finality. Night had shrouded Eleonora's room, leaving only the glow of her computer screen. A photograph on her desk showed a young girl and an older boy in a school uniform carrying her on his shoulders. 10 long years had passed since her older brother had disappeared. She impatiently waited as an email loaded. She had been communicating for 3 years with someone named Oriel Reed, a woman who claimed to have news about her estranged brother and sister-in-law. Eleonora had grown used to Oriel's stories of monsters and magic, tales so strange they would sound unbelievable to anyone who had not lived them. However, the only reason she had not dismissed the claims so readily was because of one email. The subject line announced that she had a niece. As the message loaded, she shook her head to compose herself. Emails from this woman always made her anxious. She wondered in confusion at an invitation with plane tickets attached. The email was addressed to Miss Camillo and sent by Oriel Reed. Oriel wrote that it was time for her to meet her brother's daughter and that she had arranged a flight to Italy. She explained that, although her brother had been a very devout Christian in opposition to their parents' wishes, his daughter Lucia was 10 years old and it would be better for her to meet her while she was still a child. Oriel asked Miss Camillo to consider the request for the niece's sake and said they would meet in the Vatican for the Feast of the Archangels. She pinched the bridge of her nose. The Feast of the Archangels. She had read a little about it while researching her brother's supposed monster hunter life. It was just after finals, she thought, wondering how Oriel had known enough to book tickets days after the semester ended. She brushed her black hair aside, opened a new draft, and paused with her fingers above the keyboard. She decided against running away and planned to inform her parents that it was a school-sponsored trip. With that settled, she began to type a reply. School was much the same as always. The 4 children had jumped 2 grades in what felt like the blink of an eye, moving from 2nd graders to 4th graders. Lucia, now 10, was approaching her final years of primary school. Vala's mother had moved into one of the institution's housing buildings to become an understudy to Father Ferdinand, and Eleonora had gone back to study to finish her degree, funded by Vala's mother. Valley had agreed because he simply wanted to see his mother smile, and so several days a week Eleonora would study in Berlin while Vala stayed at home with the children. Lucia walked out of school trailing Irina, Vale, and Asia. In the 2 years since starting school, she remained something of a loner with very few friends outside of the 3 ahead of her. Even shy Asia had more friends, and Vale, who Lucia had assumed was a loner like herself, surprisingly had many acquaintances. Irina ran ahead and cheered that it was winter break, which meant no school, no homework, and that Christmas was almost there, with presents to be had. Vala shook his head and reminded them that they might get in trouble again for sneaking downstairs at midnight like the last time. Irina huffed that it had been Vala's fault, and Valley countered that it had been Albion. The being called Albion resided in Vala's sacred gear, and about a year ago its voice had begun to make itself known. Even Lucia did not understand why it had chosen that moment to speak. Her mother had her theories but had never shared them. Asia tried to mediate and asked the others to stop arguing. Lucia said they probably could not sneak downstairs this time because her mother had announced they were going to Italy for Christmas. The three turned in surprise. Irina protested at the thought of Italy being so hot. Vale, curious, asked if it was really hot down there and whether the trip was because of a festival. Asia, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, blushed but gathered her courage and explained that the Feast of the Archangels was that month and that Lady Uriel seemed to want to take them. Lucia added that her mother used to take her to Italy during the festival before everything had happened, and they had not been to the feast for 3 years. Vale asked what the Feast of the Archangels was. Lucia explained that it was a festival honoring the 7 archangels and that many people would be there, including Auntie Ellie, and that it was the one day her mother allowed herself a true break. Then Lucia's face lit up as she said they would finally see Zelda again. Zelda, also known as Griselda, had been away on more and more assignments since Lucia turned 9 and had eventually stayed at the Vatican for long stretches. The others were surprised at the news that Zelda had not been home in over a year. They began imagining surprises for her. Irina thought about asking Zelda for new sword tricks. Asia wondered if Zelda could show them more miracles. Vala recalled that Zelda had mentioned finding something interesting on a mission to Ukraine and hoped she would share it. Each child had their own hopes for what to ask when they met her again, but Lucia was simply happy to spend time with her. Their conversation ended when Uriel approached. Her hair was tied back in a ponytail and she wore a red coat. She smiled and reached out to pat Lucia's head. Lucia swatted her mother's hand away, insisting that she was a big girl now. Uriel laughed and reminded them they had to go home and prepare, since they would be leaving for Italy in 2 days. Vale asked Uriel if he could really go, worried that being half-devil might cause problems inside a church. Uriel considered his question as she closed the car's passenger side door and then reassured him that it should not be an issue, since he had not done anything wrong and he would not be the only devil there. Asia, surprised, asked if he would be the only devil attending. Uriel explained that this would be a very special feast of the archangels and that other members of the factions would be coming. She reassured the children that there was nothing for them to worry about. Uriel told them that this was something the adults would discuss. Irina asked whether that meant they would not be able to see Zelda. Uriel reassured them that they would. She promised Zelda would take the 4 of them around the Vatican and that Zelda could use a break from all her work. Lucia leaned forward and asked how long they would be staying. Uriel replied that it would be about 2 weeks, just long enough for them to get back to school when they returned, and she told Lucia to sit back down because she was driving. Lucia huffed and obeyed. Vala wondered whether his mother would be there. Uriel explained that his mother was at home on an extended break because of the festival and that she had convinced the university to grant her time off, glancing at them through the rearview mirror as she spoke. As they neared the institution, Uriel slowed the car and went over the rules they would need to follow. She reminded them not to leave the Vatican grounds, saying they could wander inside the city with Griselda but must not go outside. Uriel spoke directly to Lucia, whose posture stiffened at her mother's stern gaze. Lucia nodded in acknowledgement. Uriel added that they were not to use magic in the city because many ordinary people would be there for the feast and to pray, and she did not want any accidents. She pointedly told Irina and Valley that this rule applied to them in particular, and the 2 of them grew tense at the reminder. Uriel then appointed Asia to be responsible for keeping the group from acting out, especially since children of other leaders would be present. Asia was startled and tried to shift the responsibility to Lucia, but Uriel dismissed the attempt and sent them on, saying that Elin would have dinner ready. The children ran for the front door, and Uriel called after them to remember to wash their hands as they disappeared inside. Later, while Uriel reviewed documents in her office, a pulsating flash of light drew her attention and a translucent image appeared before her. She observed Michael and noted that his hair seemed shorter. He told her his hair was still fairly long. Uriel expected he had contacted her for reasons other than a haircut. Michael allowed his gaze to soften as he handed something to someone off-screen, and a small child's hand briefly appeared in the image. Uriel asked whether he had a child. Michael explained that the child was not his. He had found her during a recent vampire attack and would tell Uriel more later. Michael confirmed that he had come to discuss security at the feast and another matter. He said that Metatron's disciple had been investigating recent rumors. The Sigurd Institute had been producing clones of Siegfried, and there were growing reports of people in the Vatican, primarily children, having gone missing. Some children from the Sigurd Institute had been reassigned with no definitive location, and the issue had been escalated. Uriel's pen paused as she absorbed the news. When she asked how long the investigation had been underway, Michael said Metatron had been looking into it for some time. Uriel asked whether their elder sister knew, and Michael replied that she did and had likely already located the source as soon as Metatron brought the information to her. Uriel resolved to mobilize the Destroying Angels to investigate, noting that Camel had been eager for action. Michael then added that the guest list from the Grigori and the Underworld had been confirmed, with Seraphal Leviathan and Surzex Lucifer representing the Devil's side and Azazel representing the Grigori. Uriel reacted with surprise at the presence of 2 Satans and Azazel. Michael remarked that 7 of their side would be attending and that he was surprised Azazel had not brought certain names along. Uriel suspected that Azazel likely had some mischief in mind regarding Helel or Gabriel. Michael reported that Azazel's group had asked for their security detail to be allowed into the city and that Surzex had requested permission for his entire peerage and his family's butler to enter the Vatican. Uriel wondered why he would bring his whole peerage, questioning whether he did not trust their security. Michael explained that Gabriel had mentioned bringing someone important, likely his wife, who served as the queen of his peerage. Uriel nodded, then caused the pen to levitate and sign documents while she walked to her coffee maker, commenting that it was going to be a busy feast. Michael agreed, expressing fear that something might happen despite all their preparations. He hoped the event could be a step toward a lasting peace after so much division. Uriel acknowledged that there would always be dissenters but agreed they could not halt their efforts because of disagreement. Michael said he wanted a future where their children would not have to grow up through war. Uriel smiled at the thought and reflected on how quickly Lucia was growing up. The fact that Uriel had managed to preserve Lucia's innocence for the most part was an achievement in itself. Having grown up in war, Uriel had wanted to give Lucia everything she had missed as a child. Soon Lucia would find her own way in the world, whether with Uriel or without her, and a small pang of loneliness rose in Uriel's chest at the thought. Uriel told Michael that she had invited Lucia's aunt to the festival. Michael replied that it was about time Lucia knew. Uriel explained that she wanted Lucia to meet her real family. Michael reminded her that Uriel was already Lucia's real family. Uriel fell silent, staring into her cup of coffee as she admitted that she was the woman who had found Lucia in that ruined town and wondered aloud whether, if she had arrived minutes earlier, Lucia's parents might still be alive and Lucia might be safe elsewhere. Michael made a soft sound of concern. Uriel looked up at him with a watery smile and said that inviting Togame to Italy was part of preparing for that possibility. If Lucia met her blood relatives and chose to go, Uriel would support her. Michael asked what would happen if Lucia chose not to. Uriel paused, then said that if Lucia chose to stay, she would be happy, though she did not want to lose her. If going with Togame meant safety, Uriel would stand behind her choice. Michael listened to his younger sister mask her doubts and insecurities with words of support for her daughter. He urged Uriel to tell Lucia directly rather than assume how she would feel and advised her to be more confident. Lucia was growing into a wonderful girl and, blood relation aside, Uriel was her mother. Uriel thanked him quietly. Michael sighed again, reminding Uriel that everything would work out in the end. She nodded meekly. When the call ended, Michael's translucent form vanished from Uriel's office, leaving her alone with her doubts. That night, Lucia gripped her plushie and tossed in bed while Irina and Asia slept nearby, unaware of the storm within her mind. Her dreams flashed chaotically, and she soon found herself standing in a snow-covered forest where her breath turned to mist under the moonlight. The night felt like a comforting embrace. She turned and saw a wounded blonde boy about a year younger than her, struggling to stay awake. Lucia reached out, but another hand passed through her. Startled, she stepped aside as flickers of static filled her vision and the figure before her resolved into someone she recognized, a crimson-haired girl. The crimson-haired girl looked down at the boy and smiled with a sadness that did not fit her age. The boy whispered a plea to save them, and the girl produced a red chess piece from her sleeve. A sharp pain flared in Lucia's head as the scene shifted. She found herself stumbling into a different place. A white-haired girl in a tattered lab gown curled up among several children. The children appeared weak and ill, some gaunt and others bruised, and a foul, sickly odor hung in the air. The white-haired girl bore bruises and small cuts, and her pale blue eyes were hollow with fear as she begged for help. Lucia backed away until her back met a wall, taking in the sterile chamber with a single mirror by a thick metal door. A short bridge passed through her mind and she was back in the woods. A gloved hand appeared before her and the crimson-haired girl's eyes flashed with desperate determination. The girl called for Lucia to get up. Lucia reached for the hand, and a brilliant light split the sky, brighter than the sun. Rays streaked across the heavens like falling stars, each carrying the weight of lost worlds. As the light descended, Lucia understood something crucial before it enveloped her and the girl. A single phrase left her lips as the light struck the earth and tore it asunder. She murmured the words "Paradise Lost." Lucia shot up with a gasp, panting and clutching at her chest. Her vision flickered as she struggled to regain control of her senses. Her ears rang and a thin trickle of blood ran from her nose from the psychological shock of the dream. Asia looked at her with worry and asked if she was okay. Lucia said she had had a bad dream. Asia offered to hug her. Lucia fell silent for a moment before Asia mentioned that Rin always hugged her when she had bad dreams and reached over to pull Lucia into a comforting embrace. Lucia widened her eyes as Asia's arms wrapped around her, and Asia's familiar scent seemed to calm her. She admitted that it had been a really scary dream. Asia held her for a few minutes, then pulled back and asked if she was still scared. Lucia stiffened at the question, thinking of the sporadic nightmares she had lately, sometimes the desert town and the shadow, other times the crimson-haired girl. This had been the first dream that vivid in a long while. Gathering herself, Lucia said she was not scared anymore and declared that she was a big girl now, so bad dreams were less frightening. She smiled and ruffled Asia's hair, thanking her. Asia puffed her cheeks and gently withdrew Lucia's hand. She reminded Lucia that Miss Uriel had said it was time for breakfast and that they would be leaving for the Vatican after everyone got ready. Lucia nodded and followed her out of the room, trying to push aside the lingering sense of foreboding from the nightmare. Winter in Rome was milder than in the Alps. Though cool, it lacked the heavy snows they were used to, and the city wore a light sheet of white this year. The seat of the church loomed ahead of them, its reverent atmosphere touched by the electric charge of feast day festivities. People wandered through the gates, marveling at the surroundings, sampling street foods and mingling. A mix of Christmas songs and hymns played in the background. Valle looked up in awe at the ancient architecture and marveled that he had never been to Rome before. As he stepped toward the gates of Vatican City, he felt the unmistakable sting of holy energy against his skin. Eleonora asked if Valle would be all right inside. Uriel considered and said that he should be fine. The power divine dividing and his half-human heritage would mitigate many of the weaknesses a pure-blooded devil might have. As Valle drew closer to the gate, the sting eased to a tingle. The girls ran past him and grabbed his arms. Lucia tightened her grip on Valle's hand and excitedly listed people she wanted him to meet, mentioning Auntie Ellie, Uncle Camel, cousins, and more. Uriel smiled as she watched Lucia and the children bypass the guards. She glanced at Tuji, Rika, and Eleonora before nodding and following after them. A flash of red light illuminated the streets of Rome. A young girl ran forward, marveling at the ancient buildings. The crisp air nipped at her skin and a cool breeze ruffled the tails of her white and purple coat. Her crimson hair fluttered as she beamed with childlike amazement and called to her brother, excited that they had finally arrived. An older man in a black coat and light brown turtleneck sweater stepped out of the red light, followed by a woman in a black coat with silver hair and several others. The woman watched the girl dart around and asked her not to run off. Surzex chided gently that the girl had been cooped up all month at the manor and needed to enjoy herself. Grafia admonished him to be careful because they were in heaven's territory, But Surzex said she should be allowed to be a child and admitted he worried she was growing up too fast since she had gained a queen and a cat and had taken on heavy responsibilities. Grayfia watched the girl smile like a child for perhaps the first time in a long while. She pinched the bridge of her nose and sighed, then linked her arm with her husband and allowed herself a small smile. She reminded him that they were in public, and he teased her about relaxing. Grayfia blushed faintly at the contact but accepted his companionship and called for Rias to join them. At the call, Rias turned and said she was coming. She took one last look at the fountain and ran to catch up with her older brother and his wife as they made their way toward the holy city.